My
Hello,
name is
everyone.
Michael Williams, and I am 27 years
and
old.
I am here to help you today.
This happened in
I
the
know
Wayne
you used
National
this video
Forest,
to fall
deep
asleep,
in the remote
so
southeastern
before that,
hills of Ohio,
please like the video
where the
and
ancient
subscribe
trees
to the
grow
channel,
so thick
and also
that
tell me
noon
where
feels
you are
like
from
twilight.
and what time you
It
are
was supposed to
watching.
be a simple
Now get
team-building
comfortable and
retreat.
relax.
Our software company, TechFlow Solutions, had been pushing us harder than usual, and our manager, Jennifer Davis, thought a long weekend camping trip would help us bond and decompress. She'd found this isolated spot near Vesuvius Recreation Area, miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a barely maintained trail that snaked through dense hardwood forest. Digital detox, she called it, insisting we leave our phones in the cars at the trailhead. The group was small, just the four of us from the development team. Jennifer, our 29-year-old team lead with her methodical planning and endless optimism. Robert Johnson, 31, our senior developer who'd grown increasingly withdrawn over the past months, spending lunch breaks alone and avoiding eye contact during meetings. And Ashley Robinson, 25, our newest hire, eager to prove herself and always volunteering for extra projects. I should have noticed the signs earlier. The way Robert's hands shook when he packed his gear, how he kept glancing over his shoulder as we hiked deeper into the forest, the strange, hungry look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. But I was focused on other things. The October air carried that crisp bite that made your lungs ache with each breath. The leaves crunched under our boots in a symphony of rust and gold. Everything seemed perfect, peaceful even, as we followed the narrow trail marked by faded orange blazes painted on tree trunks decades ago. The first mile was easy conversation and shared energy bars. The second mile, the jokes began to fade as the forest closed in around us. By the third mile, we were walking in relative silence, save for the rhythmic crunch of our footsteps and the occasional bird call echoing through the canopy above. "There," Jennifer said, consulting her GPS device and pointing to a small clearing ahead. Base camp. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering oaks and maples whose branches formed a natural ceiling high overhead. A ring of blackened stones in the center suggested others had camped here before, though I couldn't see any recent signs of use. The silence was absolute. No insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering, no wind rustling the leaves. It felt like stepping into a vacuum. "Quiet spot," Ashley observed, setting down her pack and stretching her back. "Remote," Robert muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He was staring at the tree line with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Really? Remote? We made camp with the efficient teamwork that had made us successful at the office. Jennifer and I set up the tents while Ashley gathered kindling and Robert assembled our portable camp stove. Everything proceeded normally until we tried to start a fire for the evening. The matches wouldn't catch. I went through half a box, striking one after another, watching each flame sputter and die before it could reach the carefully arranged tinder. Ashley tried her lighter with the same result. The flame would leap to life, then immediately extinguish the moment it touched the dry leaves and twigs. "Damp wood," Jennifer said, though we all knew the October weather had been bone dry for weeks. Finally, Robert produced a small camping torch and managed to get a weak flame going. But the fire was wrong. Instead of the warm orange glow we expected, it burned with a sickly blue-green tint that cast everything in an unnatural pallor. Our faces looked corpse-like in its light. "Chemical residue in the wood," Ashley suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We cooked our freeze-dried meals over the camp stove instead, eating in uncomfortable silence as darkness settled around our little clearing like a thick blanket. The strange fire continued to flicker with its unsettling colors, and I found myself avoiding looking directly at it. That's when we noticed the sounds. It started as a low humming, so quiet you might mistake it for tinnitus. Then came the rustling, not the random scatter of small animals moving through underbrush, but something rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps circling our camp just beyond the edge of our vision. "Deer," Jennifer said, but she was gripping her camp mug so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The circling continued for 20 minutes, always staying just outside the reach of our pathetic fire's glow. Occasionally, we'd catch a glimpse of movement between the trees, a darker shadow shifting against the black, the suggestion of something tall and angular watching us. "I'm going to check it out," Robert announced suddenly, standing and grabbing the flashlight. "Rob, no," Ashley said. "That's literally the first rule of every horror movie." But Robert was already moving toward the tree line, his flashlight beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkness. "Just want to make sure it's not a bear or something dangerous." We watched his light bob between the trees, growing smaller and fainter as he moved deeper into the forest. The circling sounds stopped. Everything stopped. Even our strange fire seemed to dim, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. "Robert," Jennifer called out. "Come back." No response. We called his name until our voices went hoarse, but the forest swallowed our shouts without even an echo. Ashley suggested we go look for him, but Jennifer insisted we wait until morning. "He's probably just got turned around," she said. "He'll find his way back to the fire." But I could see the doubt in her eyes, the same doubt that was eating at my gut like acid. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us slept much. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us jump. The fire continued to burn with its sick colors, never seeming to consume any actual wood, never needing to be fed. And sometime during the darkest hours before dawn, I could have sworn I heard Robert's voice calling my name from somewhere deep in the forest, but distorted, stretched thin, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Ashley heard it too. I saw her sitting bolt upright in her sleeping bag, eyes wide and staring into the trees. Dawn brought no relief. The forest around our clearing looked different in daylight, denser somehow, the trees grown closer together, the spaces between them darker despite the sun filtering through the canopy. Our trail, which had been clearly marked when we arrived, was nowhere to be found. "GPS is acting up," Jennifer announced, frowning at her device. The screen showed our location as a blue dot in the middle of blank space, no roads or landmarks visible. "Says we're 20 miles southeast of where we should be." We spent the morning searching for Robert, calling his name and following what looked like footprints in the soft earth. But the tracks seemed to lead in circles, doubling back on themselves in patterns that made no sense. Worse, some of the prints looked wrong, too long, with claw marks where toes should be. It was Ashley who found the first sign of him. "Guys!" she called from the far edge of the clearing, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You need to see this." Robert's jacket hung from a low branch, torn and stained with something dark, but it wasn't just hung there. It was arranged, spread out like scarecrow arms, facing our camp, like a warning, or an invitation. Jennifer examined the stains with the detached professionalism she brought to debugging code. "It's blood," she confirmed. "Fresh." We should have left then, packed up immediately and tried to find our way back to civilization. But Jennifer insisted we continue searching. "We can't just abandon him," she said. "He could be hurt, waiting for help." So we pressed deeper into the forest, following a game trail that seemed to shift direction when we weren't looking directly at it. The trees grew larger and older as we walked, their bark blackened and scarred as if by some ancient fire. Spanish moss hung from the branches despite this being northern Ohio, where such plants had no business growing. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the sound of our own breathing and footsteps, amplified in the dead air until every step seemed to echo like a gunshot. After 2 hours of hiking, we found him. Robert was sitting on a fallen log in a small grove, his back to us, perfectly still. He was wearing only his undershirt despite the October chill, his arms hanging at his sides like a marionette with cut strings. "Rob!" Ashley called out, relief flooding her voice. She started jogging toward him. I grabbed her arm. "Wait!" Something was wrong. Robert's posture was too rigid, too perfect, and there was a smell in the air, something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. "Robert," Jennifer called softly. "Are you okay?" Slowly, mechanically, Robert turned to face us. His smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a rictus grin that showed too many teeth. His eyes were black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, reflecting our faces like dark mirrors, and there were things moving under his skin, writhing and shifting like worms beneath pale fabric. "I'm fine," he said, and his voice was his own but wrong, layered with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "I'm better than fine. I'm perfect." Ashley screamed. Robert's head tilted at an impossible angle like an owl's, rotating nearly 180 degrees while his body remained facing forward. The sound of vertebrae cracking was loud in the dead air. "I've been waiting," he continued, his voice now echoing from multiple directions at once. "Waiting and hungry." That's when I saw them, the bones scattered around the grove. Human bones, picked clean and white as ivory. Some looked fresh. Others had been there much longer, partially buried under layers of rotting leaves. "Run," I whispered. Jennifer was already moving, grabbing Ashley's hand and pulling her back down the trail. I followed, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches, not caring about the noise we made. Behind us, I could hear Robert laughing, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like rubber, following what we hoped was the path back to our camp, but the forest seemed to shift around us, trails appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks becoming alien and wrong. The trees pressed closer with each step, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers to catch at our clothes and hair. When we finally stumbled back into our clearing, the sun was already setting. Impossible. We'd only been gone a few hours, but the light had that deep golden quality of late afternoon. Our camp looked undisturbed, but something was different. Wrong. Our supplies had changed. The freeze-dried meals we'd brought were gone, replaced by packages of raw meat that stank of decay. Our water bottles contained a thick, dark liquid that moved sluggishly when shaken, and our sleeping bags, still zipped shut but deflated, as if something had drained all the air from inside. "We need to leave," Ashley said, her voice shaking. "Now, tonight." But Jennifer was staring at her GPS again, frowning. "According to this, we've moved another 15 miles southeast. That's impossible. We've been in this clearing the whole time." The device showed us as a blue dot in an empty green space. No roads or landmarks for 50 miles in any direction. As we watched, the dot began to move slowly across the screen, heading deeper into the unmarked wilderness. "The GPS is broken," I said, but even as I spoke, I felt the ground shifting slightly beneath my feet. The clearing was moving, carrying us deeper into whatever this place had become. Night fell like a curtain, and with it came the sounds. Footsteps circling our camp, but not quite human. Too long a stride, with an odd dragging quality. The rustle of something large moving through the trees. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating up through our bones. Our fire refused to light again, so we huddled together in the darkness, backs to each other. Flashlights pointed outward like the spokes of a wheel. The beams seemed weak and sickly, swallowed by the absolute blackness beyond. "There," Ashley whispered, pointing into the trees. I followed her flashlight beam and saw him. Robert stood just at the edge of our light, swaying slightly like a tree in a breeze. But there was no wind. His smile was even wider now, splitting his face nearly in half, and something dark and wet dripped from the corners of his mouth. "I brought friends," he said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Other shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Tall, emaciated figures with 2 long limbs and faces that were almost human but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Their eyes reflected our flashlight beams like animals, and they moved with a predatory grace that spoke of endless hunger. "Wendigo," Jennifer breathed, and I realized she was right. The creature from Native American folklore, the cannibalistic spirit that possessed humans and transformed them into monsters. But this wasn't folklore. This was real, and it was all around us. They began to close in, moving with liquid smoothness, their movements perfectly synchronized like a pack of wolves. Robert led them, his transformed features more visible now, his skull elongated, his fingers stretched into claws, his skin hanging loose as if it no longer fit properly. "You ran," he said, tilting his head with that horrible owl-like motion. "That just made you tastier." Ashley broke first. She screamed and ran toward what she thought was the trail, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she crashed through the underbrush. I heard her voice fade into the distance, then cut off abruptly. Jennifer and I stood back to back, our lights creating a small island of visibility in the ocean of darkness. The Wendigo circled us, just outside our beams, occasionally allowing us glimpses of their nightmare forms. "Michael," Jennifer whispered, "do you remember what Robert was like before? Really like?" I tried to think, but my memories felt fuzzy, uncertain. Had Robert always been withdrawn? Had he always avoided eye contact? The harder I tried to remember, the more confused I became. "I think," Jennifer continued, her voice barely audible, "I think he's been gone for a while. I think whatever that thing is, it's been wearing his face for weeks." The realization hit me like ice water. The Robert who'd come on this trip, who'd been acting strange at work, who'd known exactly where to lead us, that hadn't been Robert at all. We'd been walking into a trap from the moment we'd left our cars. One of the Wendigo stepped into our circle of light, and I got my first clear look at what Robert had become. His face was a grotesque parody of humanity, stretched and warped like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. His mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth, and his eyes were black holes that seemed to go on forever. "The hunger is everything," he said, reaching toward us with claws like broken glass. "The hunger is—" Jennifer's scream pierced the night as she swung her flashlight like a club, catching the thing that had been Robert across the face. There was a wet, cracking sound, and black fluid sprayed across the clearing. The Wendigo staggered back, its inhuman shriek echoing through the forest. "Run!" Jennifer shouted, grabbing my hand. We ran blindly into the trees, our single remaining flashlight beam bouncing wildly as we crashed through undergrowth and low branches. Behind us, the night erupted in howls and the sound of pursuit. Multiple shapes crashing through the forest, moving with inhuman speed. We stumbled down what felt like a slope, our feet sliding on loose rocks and rotting leaves. Branches whipped at our faces, drawing blood, and roots caught at our ankles. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, and I could hear them breathing, a wet, rattling sound like air through damaged lungs. Suddenly, Ashley's voice cut through the darkness ahead of us. "Help! Help me!" We found her in a small ravine, sitting against a moss-covered rock, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Her flashlight lay broken beside her, its bulb shattered. "My ankle," she gasped as we approached. "I think it's broken." Jennifer knelt beside her, examining the injury with gentle fingers. "It's definitely fractured. We need to—" Ashley's hand shot out, gripping Jennifer's wrist with impossible strength. In the glow of our flashlight, I saw Ashley's eyes, completely black, just like Robert's had been. "We need to feed," Ashley said, her voice layered with those same impossible harmonics. Jennifer tried to pull away, but Ashley's grip was like iron. I watched in horror as Ashley's fingers began to elongate, the nails growing into claws that punctured Jennifer's skin. Black veins spread up Ashley's arm like infection, and her face began to stretch and distort. "The hunger," Ashley whispered, leaning closer to Jennifer's throat. "It's so beautiful." I swung my flashlight as hard as I could, catching Ashley in the temple. The impact sent shockwaves up my arm, and Ashley's head snapped to the side with a wet crack, but she didn't let go. If anything, her grip tightened. Jennifer screamed as Ashley's claws sank deeper, dark blood running down her arm. Ashley's transformation was accelerating, her skull elongating, her mouth stretching into that horrible rictus grin, her skin taking on a sickly gray pallor. I grabbed a fallen branch, thick as a baseball bat, and brought it down on Ashley's head with all my strength. This time she released Jennifer and rolled away, hissing like an angry cat. Her face was completely inhuman now, a twisted mask of hunger and rage. "Jenny, we have to go." I hauled Jennifer to her feet, and we scrambled up the opposite side of the ravine, leaving the thing that had been Ashley behind. But our escape was short-lived. The forest around us was alive with movement, shapes flitting between the trees just outside our flashlight beam. We could hear them whispering to each other in voices like wind through dead leaves, coordinating their hunt. We stumbled into another clearing, this one smaller than our original campsite, surrounded by massive pine trees that looked like standing stones in the darkness. In the center was a structure, a hunting cabin, old and weathered but intact. "There," Jennifer pointed with her good arm, her injured one cradled against her chest. "Maybe we can barricade ourselves inside." The cabin door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar as if waiting for us. Inside, our flashlight revealed a single room with a stone fireplace, some basic furniture, and walls covered with photographs. Hunting photos, I thought at first, but as our light moved across them, I realized they weren't animals. They were people. Dozens of them, posed like hunting trophies. Some I recognized from missing person reports I'd seen on the news over the years. Others looked older, their clothing and hairstyles dating back decades. All of them had the same expression of absolute terror frozen on their faces. "Jesus," Jennifer whispered. In the corner of the room, I spotted something that made my blood freeze. A pile of belongings, backpacks, hiking boots, camping gear, and on top, Robert's actual jacket. The real one, not the decoy we'd found hanging from the tree. "How long has this been going on?" Jennifer asked, but I had no answer. The whispers outside were getting closer, and I could see shadows moving past the windows. I dragged a heavy wooden table against the door while Jennifer used chairs to barricade the windows. It felt futile. The walls were thin, the windows large. If they really wanted in, they'd get in. But maybe we could buy some time. That's when I noticed the fireplace. It was large enough for a person to stand in, with a chimney that disappeared up into darkness. If we could get a fire going, maybe the smoke would signal our location to search teams. Maybe. I found kindling and old newspapers in a box beside the hearth, along with a few seasoned logs. My hands shook as I built the fire, memories of our camp's strange blue flames making me hesitant. But this time, when I struck the match, it caught normally. The fire blazed to life with reassuring orange warmth. The light revealed more details about the cabin. Scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges that could only have been made by claws, dark stains on the wooden floor that looked disturbingly like dried blood, and in the flickering firelight, the photographs on the walls seemed to move, their subjects' eyes following us as we moved about the room. The sounds outside were changing. No more whispers, no more footsteps. Just a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating through the cabin's foundation and into our bones. The fire began to flicker, its flames changing color, first orange to yellow, then yellow to blue, then that same sickly green we'd seen at our camp. "They're coming," Jennifer said, staring at the door. The scratching started on the roof, slow, deliberate, like someone drawing patterns in the wooden shingles. Then the chimney. Something was moving inside it, scraping against the stone walls as it descended. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and stood ready. Jennifer found a rusty axe mounted on the wall, testing its weight despite her injured arm. The thing that came down the chimney wasn't Robert or Ashley. It was something older, more completely transformed. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, like spider legs, allowing it to move through the narrow space with fluid grace. When it emerged from the fireplace in a shower of soot and ash, I saw that its face was completely gone, just smooth skin where features should be, broken only by a mouth full of needle teeth. It moved like liquid mercury, flowing across the floor toward us with predatory intent. I swung the poker, catching it across what I thought was its shoulder, but the iron passed through it like smoke. It solidified just as its claws reached Jennifer's throat. She brought the axe down in a desperate arc, burying the blade deep in the creature's skull. Black ichor sprayed across the cabin walls and the Wendigo's shriek shattered 2 of the windows. But it didn't die. Instead, it grabbed Jennifer by the hair and yanked her toward its gaping maw. I tackled them both, driving my shoulder into the creature's midsection and sending all 3 of us crashing into the far wall. The Wendigo's claws raked across my back, shredding my jacket and leaving burning lines of pain. But the impact had loosened its grip on Jennifer, and she rolled away, still clutching the axe. The creature turned its attention to me, and I found myself staring into that horrible, faceless visage. Its breath was like rotting meat and grave dirt, and when it spoke, the voice came from somewhere inside its chest. "Feed," it whispered. "Feed us. Feed the hunger." I grabbed a burning log from the fireplace and shoved it into the creature's mouth. The flames caught immediately, spreading across its face and down its throat. The Wendigo staggered backward, clawing at its burning head, its shrieks filling the cabin with sound like breaking glass. But even as it burned, it didn't stop moving. It lunged at me again, its claws extended, and I barely managed to dodge aside. The creature crashed through the barricaded door, taking half the wall with it, and disappeared into the night. Through the gaping hole where the door had been, I could see them. Dozens of Wendigo, standing in a perfect circle around the cabin. They swayed in unison like trees in a breeze, their black eyes reflecting the firelight. And in the center of the circle, I saw Robert and Ashley, or what they had become. "The old ways are returning," Robert said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "The hunger that made this place. Your people forgot, but the forest remembers." Ashley stepped forward, her transformed features visible in the firelight. "We've been feeding for generations, growing stronger. Your friend was just the latest course." "But you," Robert continued, "you'll be special. You'll join us willingly, or you'll feed us fighting. Either way, the hunger wins." They began to close in, moving with that same synchronized grace. I grabbed Jennifer's hand, and together we ran deeper into the cabin, toward what looked like a back room. Behind us, the Wendigo poured through the destroyed doorway like a flood of nightmares. The back room was a bedroom, with a single window that looked out into the forest. I smashed the glass with the poker and helped Jennifer climb through, ignoring the shards that cut our hands and arms. We dropped to the ground outside and ran into the trees, our footsteps muffled by decades of fallen leaves. But there was nowhere to go. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, and every path we tried seemed to lead us in circles. The Wendigo were in no hurry. They followed at a walking pace, their whispers floating through the trees like wind. They knew we were trapped. We stumbled through the darkness for what felt like hours, our single flashlight growing dimmer as the batteries failed. Jennifer's injured arm was getting worse, and she was having trouble keeping up. I could hear her breathing, becoming labored, could see the pain in her face each time she jarred her wounded limb. Finally, we collapsed beside a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 10 feet across. I clicked off the flashlight to conserve the remaining battery, and we sat in absolute darkness, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing closer. "Michael," Jennifer whispered, "if they catch us—" "They won't," I said, but we both knew it was a lie. The Wendigo weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. We could hear them moving through the forest around us, their voices calling to each other in languages that predated human speech. Sometimes one would laugh, a sound like hyenas and dying children. That's when I noticed the smell, something different from the decay and wrongness that had surrounded us all night. This was clean, fresh, like water. "Do you smell that?" I whispered to Jennifer. She nodded. "Water. There's a stream nearby." Following the sound and scent, we found it, a narrow creek winding through the forest, its water black as ink in the darkness. But it was flowing, which meant it led somewhere. maybe back to civilization. We waded into the stream, the ice-cold water shocking our systems but washing away some of the accumulated grime and blood. The current was stronger than it looked, and we had to be careful not to lose our footing on the slippery stones. Behind us, the Wendigo had reached the stream bank. I could hear them pacing back and forth, their voices raised in what sounded like argument. Something was stopping them from following us into the water. "They don't like running water," Jennifer gasped, voicing my own realization. "Like vampires, or spirits," I finished. "They're bound to the forest. The water marks a boundary." We followed the stream as quickly as we dared, fighting the current and the brutal cold. My legs went numb first, then my arms, until I was moving purely on adrenaline and will. Beside me, Jennifer was struggling even more, her injured arm making it difficult to maintain balance. The Wendigo followed along the banks, sometimes getting close enough that I could see their eyes reflecting starlight. But they never entered the water. They just paced and watched, waiting for us to make a mistake. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A bridge. Not a highway bridge, but an old wooden structure that probably served a logging road. But it was human-made, which meant we were getting closer to civilization. We hauled ourselves up onto the muddy bank on the far side of the bridge, our clothes soaked and our bodies shaking uncontrollably from the cold. But we were across. We were out of the forest. The Wendigo stood on the opposite bank, a line of twisted shadows against the trees. Robert's voice carried clearly across the water. "This isn't over," he called. "We know where you live. We know where you work. The hunger will find you." But even as he spoke, the figures were fading, melting back into the forest like mist. As the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, they were gone. We found the road 2 hours later, a narrow gravel track that eventually led to a highway. A state trooper found us there, hypothermic and babbling about monsters in the woods. He radioed for an ambulance and took us to the hospital in Athens. The official report listed it as a hiking accident. Jennifer's arm was set and casted, my back stitched up from the claw marks. We told the police about our missing friends, led them back to the area where we'd been camping, but they never found the clearing, never found the cabin. According to their GPS, we'd never left the marked trail system. Robert and Ashley were listed as missing persons, presumed dead from exposure or animal attack. The search teams found no trace of them, no evidence they'd ever been in the forest at all. That was 3 months ago. I quit my job at TechFlow Solutions, moved to a different city, changed my phone number, avoided anything that reminded me of that night in the woods. But sometimes, usually in the darkest hours before dawn, I hear them calling. Whispers outside my window, scratches on my apartment door, the sound of footsteps in the hallway that stop just outside my room. Jennifer tries to stay in touch, but our conversations are awkward and painful. We both know what we saw, what we survived, but saying it out loud makes it too real. She moved to California, as far from Ohio as she could get. Last time we talked, she mentioned that she'd been having dreams about being back in the forest, about the hunger calling her home. I've been having them too. They're getting stronger, more vivid. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my fingernails and leaves in my hair, as if I've been walking in my sleep. Walking towards something that's waiting for me in the darkness between the trees. I know they're coming. The Wendigo, the hunger, whatever you want to call it. They're patient. They've been waiting in those woods for longer than human memory, and they can wait a little longer. But eventually, they'll come to collect what they think belongs to them. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself planning a return trip to Wayne National Forest. Not because I want to. God knows I never want to see those things again. But because I understand now that some hungers can never be satisfied, only passed on. And I'm so very, very hungry. The dreams are calling me home. The Wendigo of Wayne National Forest. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in Wayne National Forest, deep in the remote southeastern hills of Ohio, where the ancient trees grow so thick they swallow sunlight whole, and the silence between heartbeats stretches into eternity. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just 4 co-workers from the accounting firm trying to escape the fluorescent-lit hell of our office cubicles. Jennifer Davis had suggested it during one of our particularly soul-crushing quarterly reviews. "We need to reconnect with nature," she'd said, her usually bright demeanor dulled by months of overtime and coffee-stained spreadsheets. Brian Wright had laughed at first, but even his perpetual cynicism couldn't mask how desperately we all needed to breathe something other than recycled office air. Ashley Robinson, ever the organizer, had already started researching campsites before Jennifer finished speaking. That's how we found ourselves driving down State Route 78 on a gray October Friday, our cars loaded with borrowed camping gear and enough supplies for 3 days in the wilderness. The Wayne National Forest stretched endlessly on both sides of the winding road, its canopy a tapestry of rust and gold that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous under the heavy, overcast sky. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Ashley called from the passenger seat of my Honda, squinting at her phone's GPS. The signal had been spotty for the last 20 miles, flickering between one bar and nothing as we wound deeper into the forest. "According to the map, yes," I replied, though doubt crept into my voice as we passed yet another unmarked dirt road disappearing into the trees. The campsite should be about 5 miles past the Lamping Homestead marker. We'd chosen Wildcat Hollow, a primitive camping area that promised solitude and minimal amenities, exactly what we thought we wanted after months of being surrounded by people and noise. The ranger station had warned us that cell service was non-existent and that we'd be completely on our own until Monday morning, but that had seemed like a feature, not a bug. Brian's Jeep followed close behind us, loaded with the tent we'd all be sharing and most of our food supplies. In my rearview mirror, I could see him gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles as we navigated another hairpin turn. City driving hadn't prepared any of us for these mountain roads. When we finally reached the weathered wooden sign marking Wildcat Hollow, the afternoon light was already fading. The camping area was nothing more than a small clearing surrounded by towering oaks and maples, with a fire ring made of blackened stones and a single picnic table that looked like it had been assembled sometime during the Carter administration. "This is rustic," Jennifer said diplomatically as we climbed out of our cars. Her usual cheerfulness seemed forced, and I noticed her glancing nervously at the wall of trees surrounding us. "It's perfect," Ashley countered, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Look how quiet it is. When's the last time any of us experienced real silence?" She was right about the silence. It pressed against us like a physical thing, broken only by the distant sound of wind through leaves and the occasional creak of ancient wood. No traffic, no sirens, no hum of air conditioning. Just the kind of profound quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. We spent the next hour setting up camp, working with the desperate efficiency of people who knew darkness was coming whether we were ready or not. The 4-person tent was more complicated than any of us had anticipated, and by the time we had it properly staked and the rainfly secured, the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. "I'll get the fire started," Brian announced, pulling out the bundle of firewood we'd bought at a gas station 30 miles back. He'd always been handy with practical things, the kind of guy who could fix a printer jam or unclog a sink without breaking a sweat. "Michael, want to help me gather some kindling?" I nodded, grateful for something to do besides stand around feeling inadequate. The forest floor was carpeted with dry leaves and fallen branches, plenty of material for a fire that should have lasted us through the night. As we worked, collecting armfuls of dead wood from the edges of the clearing, I became aware of a strange quality to the silence around us. It wasn't the peaceful quiet Ashley had mentioned, but something heavier and more oppressive. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even the fading daylight couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into the woods. "You hear that?" Brian asked suddenly, pausing with his arms full of kindling. I stopped and listened. At first, there was nothing, just that same crushing silence. Then, faintly, I caught what he was talking about. A sound like wind chimes, but wrong somehow. Too rhythmic, too deliberate. Probably just branches rubbing together, I said. But the explanation sounded hollow even to me. Brian nodded, but his eyes kept darting toward the tree line. Yeah, probably. Back at the campsite, Ashley had unpacked our food supplies and was arranging them on the picnic table with military precision. Canned beans, packages of hot dogs, marshmallows for s'mores, the kind of camping fare that seemed like a good idea in the fluorescent brightness of a grocery store, but looked somehow pathetic spread out on weathered wood under a darkening sky. "The fire's being stubborn," Brian muttered as he knelt beside the ring of stones. He'd built a perfect pyramid of kindling over a base of dry leaves and paper, but the flames kept sputtering out despite his best efforts. Must be the humidity. But the air felt dry to me, almost brittle, and there was no wind to speak of, nothing that should have interfered with a properly built fire. "Here, let me try," I offered, taking the lighter from his hands. The flame caught immediately, burning steady and blue, but the moment I touched it to the kindling, it went out. Not gradually, not the way a flame dies when starved of oxygen, but instantly, as if something had simply switched it off. "That's weird," Jennifer said, watching over my shoulder. Her voice carried a note of unease that made my stomach clench. "Try again." I did, same result. The lighter worked perfectly until the flame made contact with the wood, then nothing. "Maybe the kindling's wet," Ashley suggested, but she'd moved closer to the rest of us, unconsciously forming a tight group in the center of the clearing. "It's bone dry," Brian said, picking up a stick and breaking it in half. The snap was sharp and brittle, echoing strangely in the still air. "This should burn like paper." I tried a third time, and this time the flame not only went out but flared a sickly green color for just a moment before dying. All four of us saw it. All four of us went very still. "Okay," Ashley said slowly. "That's officially creepy." "Chemical residue on the wood," I said quickly. "Someone probably treated it with something." But even as I spoke, I was backing away from the fire ring, an instinctive retreat from something that felt fundamentally wrong. "From a gas station bundle?" Brian shook his head. "Come on, Mike. When have you ever seen treated kindling at a Sunoco?" Jennifer had pulled out her phone and was holding it up, trying to catch a signal. "I can't get any bars," she said. "Not even emergency calls." "The rangers said there wouldn't be cell service," Ashley reminded her, but her voice was strained. "No, this is different." Jennifer's fingers moved across the screen with increasing urgency. "It's not showing no signal. It's not showing anything. Like the radio's completely dead." I pulled out my own phone. She was right. The screen was dark, unresponsive. Not powered down, not displaying a low battery warning, just dead. When I tried to turn it on, nothing happened. "Mine too," Brian said, staring at his phone, but it was at 80% when we got here. Ashley's phone was the same. 4 devices, all different models and carriers, all completely dead. "This is nuts," Ashley said, her organizational instincts kicking in despite the growing unease. "Electronics don't just die simultaneously. There has to be an explanation." "Solar flare?" I suggested weakly. "Solar flares don't kill phones," Brian replied. "They disrupt signals, but they don't drain batteries." The wind chime sound came again, closer this time and definitely not from any branches rubbing together. It had a musical quality, like bones clicking against glass, and it seemed to circle the clearing before fading back into the woods. "We should go," Jennifer said suddenly. "Pack up and drive back to town. Find a motel." "In the dark?" Ashley gestured toward the trees, where the last traces of daylight were rapidly disappearing. "On those mountain roads, with no GPS?" She had a point. The road we'd taken to reach Wildcat Hollow was a maze of unmarked turns and steep drops. Without GPS, in complete darkness, we'd be more likely to end up wrapped around a tree than safely back in civilization. We stay the night, I decided, trying to project more confidence than I felt. In the morning, we pack up and leave. One night without cell phones won't kill us. But as full darkness settled over the forest, I began to question that assumption. Without a fire, the temperature dropped rapidly. We huddled together in the tent, sharing body heat and telling increasingly forced jokes to fill the oppressive silence. Outside, the forest came alive with sounds. Not the normal nighttime chorus of crickets and owls, but something else entirely. Footsteps that circled our tent for hours, always stopping just when we tried to pinpoint their location. Whispers in a language that might have been wind through leaves but felt too structured, too intentional. "Is someone out there?" Ashley whispered around midnight, her voice barely audible even in the cramped confines of the tent. We all listened. The footsteps had stopped, but something was definitely moving through the underbrush. Something large enough to snap branches, but quiet enough that we could barely hear it over our own breathing. "Probably a deer," I said, but my hand was already reaching for the baseball bat I'd optimistically packed for a potential softball game. "Deer don't walk in circles," Brian pointed out, "and they don't stop moving when they hear voices." Whatever was out there had gone silent the moment Ashley spoke. Not the natural stillness of an animal moving on, but the deliberate quiet of something listening. We lay awake until dawn, huddled together and jumping at every sound. When pale gray light finally began to filter through the tent's thin walls, I felt like I'd aged a decade in a single night. "Let's pack up," I said as soon as there was enough light to see. "We can grab breakfast in town." But when we unzipped the tent and crawled outside, we found our first real evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with Wildcat Hollow. Our cars were gone, not stolen. There were no tire tracks leading out of the clearing, no signs of forced entry or hot wiring. They were simply absent, as if they'd never existed. The ground where we'd parked showed no impressions, no oil stains, nothing to indicate that two vehicles had ever occupied the space. "This isn't possible," Ashley said, walking in slow circles around the empty area. "They were right here, both of them." "Someone moved them," Jennifer suggested, but her voice was hollow. "While we were asleep." "Moved them where?" Brian gestured toward the tree line. "There's only one road in or out of here, and we would have heard engines starting." I tried to think rationally, to find some logical explanation for what we were seeing. But my mind kept circling back to the same impossible conclusion. Our cars had simply vanished. "The keys are still in my pocket," I said, pulling them out to confirm. The metal felt wrong in my hand, too cold and somehow heavier than it should have been. "Mine too," Brian said. "So how—" "We walk," Ashley interrupted, her voice sharp with forced decisiveness. "It's only about 10 miles back to the main road. We can hike it in 3 or 4 hours." She was right. It would be a long walk, especially carrying our packs, but we were all reasonably fit. And the alternative, staying in a place where cars could disappear overnight, was unthinkable. We packed quickly, stuffing everything into our backpacks and abandoning the tent and most of our supplies. The less weight we carried, the faster we could move. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look around the clearing, searching for any clue about what had happened to our vehicles. That's when I noticed the trees. They were different. Not drastically, not in any way that would be obvious to a casual observer, but wrong enough to make my skin crawl. The oaks and maples that had surrounded our campsite the night before were still there, but their positions had shifted. The massive oak with the lightning scar that had been to our left was now to our right. The cluster of birch trees that had marked the trail to the fire road had moved 20 feet closer to the center of the clearing. "Guys," I said slowly, "look at the trees." They followed my gaze, and I watched the color drain from their faces as they realized what I was seeing. "Trees don't move," Jennifer whispered. "No," I agreed. "They don't." But these had. Somehow, during the night, the entire forest had rearranged itself around us. "We're leaving," Ashley said firmly. "Right now." We shouldered our packs and headed for what we hoped was the trail back to the fire road. But after an hour of hiking through increasingly dense undergrowth, it became clear that we were lost. The path we'd followed into Wildcat Hollow had simply disappeared, replaced by a maze of game trails that seemed to lead nowhere. "This doesn't make sense," Brian panted, stopping to check our compass for the dozenth time. "We came from the east. The road has to be east of here." But the compass needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Like our phones, it had become useless overnight. "We're being herded," Jennifer said suddenly. "Something wants us to stay lost." "Don't be ridiculous," Ashley snapped, but I could hear the fear in her voice. "We just took a wrong turn. We backtrack, find the clearing, start over." But when we tried to retrace our steps, we couldn't find the clearing either. Every direction looked the same, endless trees stretching in all directions, with no landmarks to guide us. The forest had become a labyrinth, and we were trapped at its center. By noon, we were exhausted and starting to panic. We'd been walking for hours without covering any real distance, circling back on ourselves despite our best efforts to maintain a straight line. The trees seemed to watch us with malevolent patience, their branches reaching out to snag our clothes and scratch our faces. "We should rest," I said finally, dropping my pack beside a fallen log. "Eat something, figure out our next move." We shared a can of beans and some granola bars in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest around us was completely still. No bird songs, no insect buzz, nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the whisper of wind through leaves. "I think we should split up," Ashley said suddenly. "Cover more ground." "Absolutely not," I replied immediately. "That's the first rule of being lost. Stay together." "But we're not making any progress," she argued. "If we split into pairs, we can search in different directions. When someone finds the road, they come back for the others." "And if no one finds the road?" Brian asked. Ashley didn't have an answer for that. We were still debating when we heard the scream. It came from somewhere to our north, echoing through the trees with a quality that made my blood run cold. Not a scream of surprise or pain, but something deeper and more primal. The sound of someone confronting something so terrible that language became meaningless. "Was that human?" Jennifer whispered. Before anyone could answer, the scream came again, longer this time and definitely moving toward us. Whatever was making that sound was crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed, breaking branches and sending animals fleeing in all directions. "Run," I said. We ran. Through the forest, over fallen logs and around massive tree trunks, our packs bouncing on our backs and our lungs burning from the effort. Behind us, the screaming grew closer, joined now by other sounds, a wet, tearing noise like fabric ripping, and a low growling that seemed to come from something much larger than any animal that should have been living in Ohio. We burst into another clearing, this one smaller than our campsite and dominated by a single massive oak tree whose trunk had been carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Strange markings that hurt to look at directly, as if they were designed to confuse the eye and disturb the mind. "What is this place?" Ashley gasped, staring at the carved symbols. "Doesn't matter," Brian said, already heading for the tree line on the far side of the clearing. "We keep moving." But as we reached the edge of the woods, the sounds behind us stopped. Not gradually, the way natural sounds fade with distance, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. We stood at the edge of the clearing, breathing hard and listening to the sudden silence. Nothing moved in the forest behind us. Even the wind had died. "It's gone," Jennifer said hopefully. "Whatever it was, it's—" The tree beside her exploded. Not from any impact I could see, but from the inside, as if something had burst out of the trunk with tremendous force. Splinters of wood flew in all directions, and Jennifer screamed as a shard the size of a knife blade embedded itself in her shoulder. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what crawled out of the ruined tree. It might have been human once. It had the basic shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but everything was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. Its skin was the color of old parchment and seemed to hang loose on its elongated frame, and its eyes were pools of absolute blackness that reflected no light at all. When it opened its mouth, more darkness spilled out, along with a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Wendigo," Brian whispered, and somehow I knew he was right. The creature's head turned toward him with mechanical precision, and when it smiled, I saw that its teeth were made of splinters of bone and rusted metal. We ran again, crashing through the undergrowth with the creature close behind. I could hear it moving through the trees above us, leaping from branch to branch with impossible grace, always staying just out of sight but never far away. The forest became a blur of brown and green as we fled deeper into the wilderness. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and my legs burned with every step. But the alternative to running was too horrible to contemplate. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, until our lungs felt like they were on fire and our legs gave out beneath us. We collapsed beside a small stream, gasping for air and listening for sounds of pursuit. Nothing. The forest was silent again. Where is it?" Ashley panted, clutching her side. "Gone," I hoped. Maybe it gave up. But even as I said it, I knew I was wrong. Things like the Wendigo didn't give up. They were patient. They could wait. We followed the stream for the rest of the afternoon, hoping it would lead us out of the forest. Water had to flow somewhere, and somewhere meant civilization, roads, people who could help us. But as evening approached, we found ourselves back at Wildcat Hollow, the exact same clearing where we'd started, complete with our abandoned tent and the cold ashes of the fire we'd never been able to light. It was impossible. We'd been walking in a straight line along the stream for hours, but there it was. "This isn't real," Ashley said, staring at the tent. "This can't be real." But the tent was real. The picnic table was real. The bloodstain on the ground where Jennifer had been cut by the tree splinter was real. "We're trapped," Jennifer said quietly. "Something wants us here." As if summoned by her words, Brian stepped out of the tree line. We all turned toward him in relief, and it took several seconds for us to realize that something was terribly wrong. Brian had been with us all day. I was sure of it. But here he was, emerging from the forest as if he'd been somewhere else entirely. "Brian," Ashley called uncertainly. "Where did you go?" He smiled at her, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was exactly the same as always. But there was something underneath it, a hollow quality that made my skin crawl. "I went to get firewood," he said, holding up an armload of dead branches. "For tonight." "But you were just—" I started to say, then stopped. Had he been with us? Suddenly, I couldn't remember. The day felt fragmented, like a dream half forgotten upon waking. "We should get the fire started," Brian continued, walking toward the ring of stones. "It gets cold at night." He knelt beside the fire ring and began arranging the wood with the same meticulous care he'd shown the night before. But his movements were wrong, somehow. Too precise, too deliberate, like a marionette being controlled by someone who'd only read about human behavior in books. "Brian," I said carefully, "are you feeling okay?" He looked up at me, and for just a moment, I saw something behind his eyes. Something vast and hungry and not remotely human. "I'm fine," he said, and his smile widened until it showed too many teeth. "Never better." The kindling caught fire immediately this time, burning with a steady orange flame that cast dancing shadows across the clearing. Brian sat back on his heels, looking pleased with himself. "See?" he said. "Just needed the right touch." Ashley had gone very still beside me. "Brian," she said slowly, "what happened to your hands?" I looked down at his hands and felt my stomach clench. His fingernails were gone, replaced by something that looked like blackened bone. And there was something under his skin, moving just beneath the surface like parasites. "What do you mean?" Brian asked, flexing his fingers. The bone things clicked together like castanets. "My hands are fine." "We need to go," I whispered to Ashley and Jennifer. "Right now." But Brian was already standing, moving between us and the tree line with fluid grace. "Where would you go?" he asked, tilting his head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be human. "There's nowhere to run. The forest won't let you leave." "You're not Brian," Jennifer said, backing away from the fire. "Of course I'm Brian," he replied, and for a moment his voice was exactly right. Confused, hurt, entirely human. "I'm your friend, your co-worker. We've been planning this trip for weeks." But then the mask slipped again, and I saw the thing underneath. Ancient, hungry, patient beyond human understanding. "I am what Brian became," it said, its voice layering over itself like an echo. "What you will all become, given time." Ashley made a break for the trees, but the thing that had been Brian moved faster than should have been possible. One moment it was standing by the fire, the next it had her by the throat, lifting her off the ground with one impossibly strong hand. "The hunger is terrible," it said conversationally as Ashley clawed at its fingers. "It gnaws at you, consumes you from the inside. But once you give in, once you feed, it becomes manageable." Ashley's face was turning blue. I grabbed a piece of firewood and swung it at the creature's head as hard as I could. The wood shattered on impact, but the thing didn't even flinch. "Such violence," it said sadly. "Is this how friends treat each other?" Jennifer picked up a rock and hurled it at the creature's face. This time, it did react. Not in pain, but in annoyance. It turned its head toward her with mechanical precision. "Rude," it said, and Ashley's neck snapped with a sound like a breaking branch. It dropped her body and took a step toward Jennifer, its head tilting at that same impossible angle. "Who's next?" I looked around desperately for a weapon, anything that might hurt this thing. My eyes fell on the fire, still burning steadily despite the chaos around it. Fire. One of humanity's oldest weapons against the darkness. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire ring and thrust it at the creature's face. This time it recoiled, hissing like a stepped-on snake. "Ah," it said, its voice now layered with what might have been respect. "You remember the old ways." "Stay back," I warned, holding the makeshift torch between us. "Jennifer, get behind me." The creature that had been Brian circled us slowly, staying just out of reach of the flames. "Fire won't save you forever," it said. "And when it dies, I'll still be here." "Maybe," I agreed, "but right now, it's keeping you away." "For now," it agreed, and its smile was terrible. "But I can wait. I'm very patient." The standoff continued for what felt like hours. The creature stalked around the edges of our small circle of light, always watching, always waiting for our guard to drop. Jennifer pressed against my back and I could feel her shaking. "What does it want?" she whispered. "To feed," I replied, remembering the old stories my grandmother had told me about the Wendigo. "And to make more like itself. Brian's really dead, isn't he?" I thought about the hollow look in his eyes, the way he'd moved like a puppet on strings. "Yeah," I said, "he's gone." The creature heard us talking and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Brian is still here," it said. "Part of him anyway. He's screaming, deep down where you can't hear. But he can hear everything. He knows what I'm going to do to you." The torch was burning down faster than I'd hoped. Soon, we'd be defenseless. "The car keys," I said suddenly. "In my pocket. If we can get to where we parked—" "The cars are gone," Jennifer reminded me. "You saw." "No," I said, understanding flooding through me. "They were never gone. That's part of the trap, part of the spell. Everything we've seen, everything that's happened, it's all designed to keep us here." The creature stopped circling and fixed its black eyes on me. "Clever," it said. "But what makes you think you can break free?" "Fire," I said, and threw the torch directly at the tent. The nylon fabric caught immediately, going up in a whoosh of orange flame that lit the entire clearing. In the sudden brightness, I saw our cars exactly where we'd left them, solid and real and beautiful. The creature shrieked as the fire spread, and for a moment its disguise slipped completely. I saw what it really was, something made of shadow and hunger, with too many limbs and a mouth full of needle teeth. It writhed in the light like a vampire exposed to sunlight. "Run!" I shouted to Jennifer, and we sprinted for my Honda. The keys were in my hand, still cold and wrong feeling, but they worked. The engine turned over on the first try, and I gunned it toward the fire road before the creature could recover. In the rearview mirror, I saw it give chase, moving through the trees with impossible speed, but it couldn't keep up with the car. As we reached the main road and civilization, the thing fell behind and finally disappeared. We drove straight to the nearest police station, but our story sounded insane even to us. Missing friends, supernatural creatures, cars that disappeared and reappeared. They listened politely and filed a report, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Search teams found Brian's body 3 days later, deep in the Wayne National Forest. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, though no one could identify what kind of animal could have done that much damage. Ashley's body was never found. Jennifer quit her job and moved to California. She sends me emails sometimes, but we never talk about what happened in the forest. Some experiences are too dark to share, even with the only other person who lived through them. I still work at the same accounting firm, still push papers and crunch numbers under fluorescent lights. But sometimes, late at night when the office is empty except for the cleaning crew, I hear something moving in the walls. Something patient and hungry, waiting for me to be alone. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see my fingernails growing just a little too long, just a little too sharp. When that happens, I clip them short and try not to think about the hunger that's been growing in my belly ever since that night in Wayne National Forest. Because I know the truth now. The Wendigo doesn't just kill its victims, it plants seeds, and those seeds are starting to grow. My name is Joshua Allen, and I am 23 years old. This happened in the Wayne National Forest, deep in the hollows of southeastern Ohio, where the ancient hills swallow sound and the trees grow so thick they blot out the sky. Brandon Edwards and I had been best friends since our freshman year at Ohio State. We'd always talked about doing a real backpacking trip, something to test ourselves against the wilderness before we graduated and got swallowed up by corporate jobs. That October, with the leaves turning blood red and golden, we finally made it happen. "Dude, this place is perfect," Brandon said as we studied the topographic map spread across his dorm room floor. His finger traced the contour lines through the most remote section of Wayne National Forest, near the abandoned mining town of Haydenville. "Look at this. No major trails, no campgrounds, just pure wilderness. We'll be completely off the grid." I should have paid attention to that phrase. Completely off the grid. I should have noticed how his eyes gleamed when he said it, like he was hungry for something I couldn't name. Brandon was always the more adventurous one. Where I was cautious, methodical, he was impulsive and bold. 6'2", with broad shoulders from years of wrestling, he had this easy confidence that drew people to him. I was the opposite. Average height, thin, the kind of guy who triple-checked his gear and always brought backup batteries. Maybe that's why we worked as friends. We balanced each other out. Or so I thought. The drive down to the forest took 3 hours, winding through small Ohio towns with names like New Straitsville and Shawnee. October had been unusually warm, but as we climbed into the foothills, the temperature dropped noticeably. Brandon drove his beat-up Jeep Cherokee with the windows down, classic rock blasting, while I studied our route for the 100th time. "You're overthinking it, Josh," he said, glancing at my notebook full of waypoints and emergency contacts. "It's just 3 days in the woods. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words. We parked at the end of a gravel logging road, marked only by a rusted Forest Service sign that had been peppered with buckshot. The silence hit us immediately when Brandon turned off the engine. No traffic, no planes overhead, just the whisper of wind through dying leaves. "This is it," Brandon said, shouldering his pack. He'd gone minimalist, carrying maybe 40 pounds to my 60. The real deal. I checked my GPS unit one more time. The device showed our location clearly, about 8 miles from the nearest maintained trail. Our planned route would take us deeper into the forest, following an old logging road for the first 2 miles before branching off into unmarked wilderness. We'd camp the first night near Wheelabout Creek, then push deeper for day 2. The forest felt ancient as we hiked in. These weren't the managed woodlands you'd find in state parks, but true old-growth timber that had somehow escaped the logging that stripped most of Ohio bare in the 1800s. Massive oaks and maples towered overhead, their canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. The underbrush was dense with mountain laurel and wild rhododendron, creating natural walls on either side of the overgrown logging road. "It's like a green tunnel," I said, trying to shake off the claustrophobic feeling creeping up my spine. "I know, right? It's awesome." Brandon was practically bouncing as he walked, his energy infectious despite my growing unease. "When's the last time you felt this disconnected from everything?" He was right. No cell towers reached this deep into the forest. Our phones had lost signal miles ago. Even my GPS was starting to act weird, the satellite fix wavering between accurate and completely wrong. But Brandon seemed to relish the isolation. We made good time the first day, covering nearly 6 miles before the old logging road petered out into deer trails and game paths. The plan was to follow Wheelabout Creek until we found a suitable campsite, but when we reached the water, something felt off. The creek was running backward. I stood there for a full minute, watching leaves and debris float upstream, against the current that should have been flowing downhill toward the Ohio River. The water made no sound as it moved, which was impossible for a creek this size. "Brandon, look at this." But when I turned around, he was gone. "Brandon," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the dense woods. The sound seemed to bounce back distorted, like it was coming from underwater. A rustling in the bushes behind me made me spin around. Brandon emerged from a thicket of wild grapevines, grinning. "Sorry, man. Nature called." He gestured toward the creek. "Nice spot. This'll work for camp." I wanted to point out the backward flowing water, but when I looked again, the creek was running normally. Leaves drifted downstream as they should, and the sound of flowing water returned. I must have been more tired than I thought. We set up camp in a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek. Brandon's enthusiasm was infectious as we worked, joking and laughing as we pitched our tents and gathered firewood. By the time the sun set, earlier than expected in the thick forest, we had a good fire going and were heating up our freeze-dried dinners. "This is the life," Brandon said, leaning back against a fallen log. "No homework, no professors, no responsibilities. Just us and the wilderness." I tried to share his enthusiasm, but something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. In all my camping experience, I'd never encountered woods this silent. No insects, no birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the fire seemed muted, its crackling dampened by the oppressive atmosphere. "You hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "Exactly, nothing. No sounds at all." Brandon cocked his head, listening. "Huh. Weird. Maybe it's just the season. Everything's getting ready for winter." But I'd camped in October before. The woods should have been alive with migrating birds and animals preparing for winter. This silence was unnatural, predatory, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We turned in early, both of us exhausted from the long hike. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. Through the thin nylon of my tent, I could see the dying glow of our fire casting dancing shadows on the trees. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a sound like wind chimes but deeper, more resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a haunting melody that made my skin crawl. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening as the sound grew closer, then faded away into the distance. "Brandon," I whispered, "you awake?" No answer from his tent. The sound came again, closer this time. Not wind chimes. Bones. The sound of bones clacking together in the wind. I unzipped my tent flap just enough to peer out. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting everything in deep red shadows. Brandon's tent was zipped tight. No movement inside. Then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Footprints in the soft earth around our campsite. But not human footprints. These were elongated with what looked like claw marks at the tips. They circled our tents in a perfect spiral, getting closer and closer to where we slept. I wanted to wake Brandon, but something primitive in my brain screamed at me to stay still, to not draw attention to myself. Whatever had made those tracks might still be out there, watching, waiting. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to that terrible bone chime sound drifting through the forest. Twice I heard something large moving through the underbrush, and once I could have sworn I heard breathing right outside my tent. But I didn't move, didn't make a sound, until the first pale light of dawn filtered through the canopy. When I finally emerged from my tent, the footprints were gone. The earth around our campsite looked undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen. "Sleep well?" Brandon asked, emerging from his own tent looking refreshed and energetic. If he'd heard anything during the night, he didn't show it. "Not really. Did you hear anything? Sounds in the woods?" He shook his head, already busy rekindling the fire. "Dead to the world, man. Best sleep I've had in months." I didn't press the issue. Maybe I'd imagined it. Stress, fatigue, and an overactive imagination could play tricks on the mind. That's what I told myself as we broke camp and prepared for day 2. The plan was to hike deeper into the forest, following a ridgeline that would eventually bring us to an old fire tower marked on our topographic map. From there, we'd have a view of the surrounding country and could plan our route for day 3. But as we hiked, the forest seemed to change around us. Paths that should have led uphill curved back on themselves. The sun, when I could glimpse it through the canopy, seemed to be in the wrong position, and my GPS unit had completely given up, showing only a blinking question mark where our coordinates should have been. "I think we're lost," I said during a rest break, spreading out the topographic map on a fallen log. Brandon looked over my shoulder, but instead of concern, I saw something else in his eyes. Excitement? Hunger? "Lost is just another word for exploring," he said. "Besides, we've got food for 5 days. Plenty of time to figure out where we are." "That's not the point. Something's wrong here. The GPS doesn't work, the compass keeps spinning, and I swear some of these trees weren't here yesterday." Brandon laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're being paranoid, Josh. It's just the forest messing with your head. Happens to everyone when they get away from civilization." But as we continued hiking, I became more and more certain that we weren't just lost. We were being led. The game trails we followed seemed too convenient, always appearing just when we needed them, always leading us deeper into the forest. And the silence was getting worse. Not even the sound of our own footsteps seemed to penetrate the oppressive quiet. By afternoon, we came to another creek. Or maybe the same creek, I couldn't tell anymore. The water was crystal clear, running over smooth stones, and beside it was a perfect camping spot. Level ground, a ring of stones for a fire pit, even a fallen log positioned like a bench. "This is too convenient," I said. "It's like someone prepared this spot for us." "Or maybe other campers used it before us," Brandon replied, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Come on, let's set up camp. I'm beat." As we worked to establish our second campsite, I noticed Brandon kept glancing into the forest, like he was listening for something. His movements had become more deliberate, almost ritualistic as he arranged his gear. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine. Just, do you feel it? The forest. It's alive, Josh. Really alive." I didn't like the way he said it. There was something wrong with his voice, a hunger that hadn't been there before. We went through the motions of making dinner, but neither of us ate much. The freeze-dried beef stroganoff tasted like cardboard, and every bite seemed to stick in my throat. As darkness fell, the silence became absolute. Even our fire made no sound, burning with flames that seemed dimmer than they should have been. "I'm going to gather more firewood," Brandon said, standing up abruptly. "I'll come with you." "No." His voice was sharp, commanding. Then he seemed to catch himself. "I mean, no need. You tend the fire. I'll be back in a few minutes." He grabbed his headlamp and disappeared into the forest before I could argue. I sat by the dying fire, feeding it twigs and small branches, listening for any sound of his return. But the forest had swallowed him completely. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. "Brandon," I called out. "Brandon, where are you?" My voice was absorbed by the trees, returning no echo. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. Something was very wrong. I grabbed my own headlamp and started into the forest, following the direction Brandon had gone. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the crushing darkness, illuminating only a few feet in any direction. I called his name every few steps, but the sound died as soon as it left my mouth. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I heard him. "Josh." The voice came from somewhere ahead of me, barely audible. I hurried toward it, my headlamp beam dancing wildly as I pushed through the underbrush. "Brandon, where are you?" "Here." The voice was closer now, but something about it was off. The inflection was wrong, like someone was trying to imitate Brandon's voice but didn't quite have it right. I found him standing in a small clearing, his back to me. He was perfectly still, not even breathing that I could see. "Thank God," I said, relief flooding through me. I was worried sick. "What happened? You've been gone for almost an hour." He didn't answer, didn't move. "Brandon." Slowly, very slowly, he turned around. It was Brandon's face, but not quite. His eyes were wrong, too wide, too dark, like they were all pupil. His skin had a grayish pallor in the headlamp beam, and when he smiled, I saw that his teeth had become pointed, predatory. "I found it," he said, and his voice was definitely wrong now. Too deep, with an undertone that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Found what?" "What I was looking for." He took a step toward me, and I saw that his movements were different too. Too fluid, like his joints bent in ways they shouldn't. My primitive brain screamed danger, and I took a step back. "Brandon, you're scaring me. Are you okay?" "I'm perfect," he said, and took another step forward. "Better than I've ever been. The forest showed me what I really am, Josh. What we both are." I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard something that might have been laughter, but it sounded like wind through dead leaves. I crashed through the underbrush, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away from whatever Brandon had become. I burst back into our campsite, gasping and wild-eyed. The fire had died completely, leaving only cold ashes. My hands shook as I fumbled for my flashlight, desperate for more light in the crushing darkness. That's when I saw him. Brandon was sitting by the dead fire, exactly as he'd been when he left to gather wood. Same clothes, same position, same expression. But I'd just seen him in the forest, changed into something horrible. "Hey, Josh," he said casually. "Where'd you go? I was wondering where you disappeared to." I stood frozen, my flashlight beam illuminating his face. He looked completely normal, human. No pointed teeth, no dead eyes, no unnatural movements. I was looking for you. You went to get firewood and didn't come back." He frowned, looking genuinely confused. "What do you mean? I just got back a minute ago, found some great dry wood." He gestured to a neat pile of branches beside the dead fire pit. The wood was there, perfectly arranged, bone-dry despite the humidity in the forest. But I was certain it hadn't been there when I'd left to look for him. "Brandon, this is going to sound crazy, but I think something's wrong with this place. We need to leave, tonight." "Leave?" He looked at me like I'd suggested we fly to the moon. "Why would we leave? We just got here. Besides, it's pitch black out there. We'd never find our way. Something happened to you in the forest. You changed. I saw you, and you weren't human anymore." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the flashlight beam. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're right, Josh. Something did happen to me in the forest." His voice was calm, reasonable. I realized what I've been missing all my life: the hunger. The word hit me like a physical blow. Hunger. The way he said it, with such longing and satisfaction, made my skin crawl. What kind of hunger? The kind that can only be satisfied by fresh meat, warm blood, the terror in someone's eyes as they realize they're about to die. I backed away from him, my hand moving instinctively to the knife on my belt. But Brandon just sat there, smiling that terrible smile. "You can't run, Josh. Not in the dark. Not in this forest. It doesn't want you to leave." "You're sick," I said. "Something in this place is making you sick. We need to get you to a hospital." "I'm not sick." He stood up slowly, and I saw that fluid, unnatural movement again. "I'm evolved. The Wendigo showed me what humans really are underneath all the civilization and pretense. We're predators, Josh. Apex predators, and I'm tired of pretending to be anything else." Wendigo. The word hit me like ice water. I'd heard the stories in my Native American history class, ancient spirits of the wilderness that possessed people, turning them into cannibalistic monsters with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. "That's just folklore," I said, but my voice shook. "Is it?" Brandon tilted his head, bird-like. "Then explain this." He opened his mouth, and I saw that his teeth had indeed become pointed, razor-sharp. His fingers had grown long, ending in black claws. And his eyes. God, his eyes were completely black now, reflecting my flashlight beam like an animal's. I ran again. This time, I had a destination. Our packs were still in our tents, and I had a whistle in mine, one of those emergency whistles that could be heard for miles. If there were any other campers in the area, any park rangers, anyone who might help, the whistle would bring them. I dove into my tent and frantically searched through my pack. My hands closed around the whistle just as I heard movement outside, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. "You can't hide from me, Josh." Brandon's voice, but distorted now. Inhuman. "I can smell your fear. I can hear your heartbeat. It sounds delicious." I brought the whistle to my lips and blew as hard as I could. The sound was sharp and piercing, echoing through the forest. I blew it again and again, 3 short blasts followed by 3 long ones. The universal distress signal. Something slashed through the side of my tent, leaving parallel tears in the nylon. Brandon's clawed hand reached through, grasping for me. I rolled away just in time, still clutching the whistle. "Help!" I screamed. "Someone help me!" But even as I yelled, I knew it was hopeless. We were miles from civilization, and the forest seemed to swallow sound. No one would hear, no one would come. I crawled out the back of my tent and found myself face to face with Brandon. But this wasn't the friend I'd known for 3 years. This was something else wearing his skin. His face had elongated, becoming gaunt and predatory. His limbs were too long, and when he moved, his joints made wet, cracking sounds. "You taste afraid," he said, and his voice was like wind through a graveyard. "Good. Fear makes the meat tender." I swung my flashlight at his head, but he caught my wrist effortlessly. His grip was ice-cold and impossibly strong. "I was going to make this quick," he said, leaning close enough that I could smell his breath, rot and decay and something else, something that made my stomach turn. "But now I think I'll take my time. The Wendigo wants to savor this." That's when I remembered the other item in my emergency kit. Bear spray. Pepper spray strong enough to drop a grizzly bear. I let my body go limp, pretending to give up. Brandon loosened his grip slightly, probably savoring what he thought was my surrender. With my free hand, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the canister of bear spray. "Goodbye, Josh," Brandon said, opening his mouth to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. I emptied the entire canister into his face. The effect was immediate and devastating. Whatever Brandon had become, it was still vulnerable to capsaicin. He released me and staggered backward, clawing at his eyes and making sounds no human throat could produce. A mixture of screaming and animal howling that echoed through the forest. I didn't wait to see if it would be enough. I grabbed my pack and ran into the darkness, using my flashlight to navigate through the dense underbrush. Behind me, I could hear Brandon, or the thing wearing his face, thrashing through the forest, still making those inhuman sounds. I ran for what felt like hours, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow looked like a predator, every sound like pursuit. But gradually, the sounds behind me faded, and I found myself alone in the vast darkness of the Wayne National Forest. That's when I realized I had no idea where I was or how to get out. My GPS was still useless, showing only error messages. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Even the stars were wrong. Constellations I didn't recognize in a sky that seemed too vast and too close at the same time. I was truly lost in a place that shouldn't exist, pursued by something that used to be my best friend. I kept moving, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing, trees rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where the laws of physics no longer applied. Dawn found me stumbling along what might have been a trail, though it was unlike any trail I'd ever seen. The path seemed to glow faintly in the growing light, leading steadily upward through terrain that felt familiar and alien at the same time. I followed it because I had no choice. My water was almost gone. My emergency food wouldn't last another day, and I was beginning to hallucinate from exhaustion and stress. The glowing path was my only hope of finding a way out of this supernatural labyrinth. As the sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in strange prismatic beams, I began to hear something that filled me with hope and terror in equal measure. The sound of someone calling my name. "Josh! Josh, where are you?" It was Brandon's voice, but not the distorted monster voice from the night before. This sounded like my friend, normal and human and concerned. "I'm sorry, man," the voice continued. "I don't know what happened last night. I think I had some kind of breakdown. Please, Josh, I need help." I stopped walking and listened. The voice was coming from somewhere behind me, back the way I'd come. It sounded genuine, filled with confusion and remorse, but I remembered the way he'd looked at me with those black eyes. I remembered the pointed teeth and the claws. Most of all, I remembered the hunger in his voice when he talked about fresh meat and warm blood. "Josh, please. I'm hurt. I can't see out of my right eye and I think I'm bleeding internally. I need you to help me get to a hospital." The bear spray. Of course he'd be hurt. Maybe I'd been wrong about what I'd seen. Maybe Brandon had eaten something that made him sick, caused him to hallucinate or become violent. Maybe there was a rational explanation for everything that had happened. I almost turned back. The part of me that had been his friend for 3 years wanted desperately to believe that this was all a misunderstanding, that my best friend needed help and I was abandoning him. But then I heard it, underneath his pleading voice, almost inaudible but definitely there, the sound of bones clicking together. The same wind chime sound I'd heard our first night in the forest. It was a trap. I turned and ran again, following the glowing path as it wound higher into the mountains. Behind me, Brandon's voice changed, becoming frustrated, then angry, then inhuman once more. "You can't escape, Josh. This forest is mine now. I'll find you. I'll always find you." The voice faded as I climbed, but I didn't slow down. The path led me up a steep ridge through terrain that shouldn't have been possible in southeastern Ohio. These weren't the gentle hills I'd grown up with. These were real mountains, with sheer cliff faces and deep ravines that plunged into misty darkness. At the top of the ridge, I found something impossible, the fire tower from our map. It was exactly where it should have been, according to our topographic charts, but those charts had been made for the normal world, the world with laws of physics and geography that made sense. This tower existed in whatever twisted reality I'd stumbled into. I climbed the rusted steel stairs, my legs trembling with exhaustion. At the top, I found an abandoned ranger station with windows on all four sides. Through those windows, I could see the world as it really was. To the north, the forest stretched endlessly, far beyond what should have been possible in Ohio. Ancient trees rose like cathedral spires, and between them moved shapes that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. To the east and west, the landscape was equally impossible, canyons and mesas that belonged in Arizona, not the Midwest. But to the south, I saw salvation, a thin line of normal forest, green and familiar, with what looked like a paved road running through it, the edge of whatever supernatural realm I'd entered. I also saw Brandon. He was climbing the ridge below me, but he wasn't using the path. Instead, he was moving straight up the cliff face, his elongated limbs finding purchase on rock that should have been impossible to climb. His movements were spider-like, inhuman, and as I watched, he raised his head and looked directly at me with those terrible black eyes. Even from this distance, I could see him smile. I had maybe 10 minutes before he reached the tower. In the ranger station, I found an old emergency radio, but when I tried to use it, the only thing that came through the speakers was static mixed with what sounded like screaming. But I also found something else, a logbook left by the last ranger to man this station. The final entry was dated 3 years ago and written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as it went on. October 15th, something wrong in Sector 7. Hikers reporting strange sounds, equipment failures. Johnson went to investigate 2 days ago. Haven't heard from him since. October the 18th, found Johnson's campsite, tent shredded from inside, blood everywhere but no body. Tracks leading away but not human tracks. Requesting immediate backup. October 20th, backup never came, radio dead, something in the forest calling my name with my wife's voice. Can't leave the tower, it's the only safe place. October 23rd, it got inside, not my wife, never was my wife, taking the form of everyone I've ever loved. Can't trust anyone anymore. Can't trust myself. October 25th, the hunger is getting stronger. I understand now why Johnson never came back. The forest doesn't just take you, it makes you part of it, makes you hungry for the things you used to protect. The final entry was just one word, written over and over again in what looked like dried blood. Hungry, 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 hungry. I slammed the logbook shut and looked out the south window again. The normal forest was still there, maybe 2 miles away through the supernatural landscape. If I could reach it, I might be able to escape whatever had infected this place. The sound of claws on metal told me Brandon had reached the tower. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from the ranger station wall and started down the stairs, moving as quietly as possible. But Brandon was already inside the tower structure, climbing up toward me with that terrible fluid grace. "Found you," he said, and his voice echoed strangely in the metal framework. "I told you that you couldn't escape." I raised the flare gun and fired. The flare caught him in the chest and he screamed, not with pain, but with rage. The burning magnesium ignited his shirt and hair, but instead of flesh, I saw something else underneath, shadows and smoke and writhing darkness that hurt to look at directly. But the flare didn't stop him. If anything, it seemed to make him angrier. I ran down the remaining stairs and into the forest, abandoning stealth for pure speed. Behind me, the fire tower groaned and shook as Brandon, or the thing that had been Brandon, tore it apart in his fury. The glowing path was gone, leaving me to navigate by instinct and desperation. I crashed through underbrush and over fallen logs, driven by the sound of pursuit behind me. Every few seconds I could hear trees snapping as my pursuer came after me. The landscape began to change as I ran. The impossible mountains and canyons gradually gave way to normal Ohio forest, rolling hills covered with oak and maple. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by natural forest sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals in the leaves. I was getting close to the edge of the supernatural realm. That's when I stumbled and fell, tumbling down a steep slope to land hard against a tree trunk. Pain shot through my left ankle, and when I tried to stand, I nearly blacked out. Sprained or broken, either way, I wasn't running anymore. Above me, I heard branches breaking as Brandon approached. I looked around frantically for any kind of weapon or shelter, but there was nothing. Just normal forest and a small creek running nearby. The creek, running water. I remembered something from my Native American history class, a detail about Wendigo folklore that had seemed like superstition at the time. Wendigos were creatures of the deep forest, bound to the wilderness that created them. They couldn't cross running water. I dragged myself toward the creek, my injured ankle screaming with every movement. The water was shallow but fast-moving, maybe 3 feet wide. I pulled myself across just as Brandon emerged from the trees behind me. He stopped at the water's edge, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw frustration in his inhuman features. "That won't work forever," he said. "You have to eat sometime, sleep sometime, and when you do, I'll be waiting." But even as he said it, I could see him beginning to fade around the edges, becoming translucent. The normal forest was reasserting itself, pushing back against the supernatural intrusion he represented. "The hunger will find you, Josh," he said, his voice becoming distant and echoing. "It found me, and it'll find you too. You can't fight what you really are." Then he was gone, dissolved into shadows and mist that the morning sun quickly burned away. I lay beside the creek for a long time, shaking with exhaustion and shock. When I finally felt strong enough to move, I followed the water downstream until I found a hiking trail. A real trail, marked with official Forest Service blazes. 3 hours later, I limped out of the Wayne National Forest and flagged down a passing motorist who drove me to the nearest hospital. The official story was simple: a hiking accident. Brandon had fallen into a ravine while gathering firewood, and despite extensive searching, his body was never found. The Forest Service assumed he'd been carried away by seasonal flooding. I never told them what really happened. Who would have believed me? But I know the truth. Brandon is still out there, somewhere in the deep woods where the maps don't match the terrain and the laws of nature don't apply, waiting for the next group of hikers to venture too far from civilization, waiting to share the hunger that consumed him. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone, I can feel that hunger stirring in myself, a craving for something raw and red and screaming. Because Brandon was right about one thing. The forest doesn't just take you, it makes you part of it. I've never gone camping since that October weekend 3 years ago. Never will again, because I know that if I venture too deep into the wilderness, I might find Brandon waiting for me. Or worse, I might find myself wanting to join him. The Wendigo doesn't just possess its victims, it creates them. And once you've looked into that terrible hunger, once you've felt it calling to something dark and primitive in your own soul, you're never quite human again. I graduated from Ohio State, got a job in Columbus, settled into a normal urban life. But sometimes I catch myself standing at my apartment window, looking west toward the forest, and feeling that familiar ache of longing. The hunger is patient. It can wait. And someday, I'm afraid it won't have to wait anymore. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Hocking Hills State Forest in southeastern Ohio, where the ancient sandstone cliffs hide secrets that should never see daylight. The idea for the camping trip came during one of those suffocating Monday morning meetings at the insurance office. Janet Reed, our department supervisor, thought a team-building retreat would boost morale after the company's recent layoffs. Looking back, I should have recognized the desperation in her voice, the way her fingers trembled when she handed out the printed itineraries. But we were all desperate then. desperate to escape our gray cubicles, desperate to prove we were still valuable employees worth keeping around. "Hocking Hills will be perfect," she'd said, spreading out a topographical map across the conference table. 3 days, 2 nights, just us and nature. The way she emphasized nature should have been a warning. Our group consisted of 5 co-workers who barely knew each other outside of shared complaints about the coffee machine. There was Janet, 43, with her nervous energy and habit of checking her phone every 30 seconds. Kevin King, 35, our IT guy who treated everything like a problem to be debugged. Sarah Rodriguez, 27, from accounting, who'd recently moved to Ohio from California and was eager to explore. And then there was Brandon Edwards, 31, from sales, the kind of guy who wore his confidence like an expensive cologne and never seemed to doubt himself about anything. We carpooled in Kevin's oversized SUV, following State Route 374 deeper into the forest than any of us had ever been. The GPS worked fine until we reached the turnoff for our designated camping area, a secluded spot called Whispering Pine Hollow that Janet had found on some obscure hiking website. That's when Kevin's phone started acting up, the screen flickering between our location and empty gray static. "Probably just poor cell coverage," Kevin muttered, but I caught him pressing the power button repeatedly, his tech-savvy confidence wavering for the first time since I'd known him. The camping spot was everything the website had promised and nothing we were prepared for. A small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees with a crystal-clear stream running along one edge. But there was something else. Something the website hadn't mentioned. The silence was wrong. Not peaceful, but oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Even the stream seemed to whisper rather than babble. "This is incredible," Sarah said, but her voice carried forced enthusiasm. She kept glancing over her shoulder as we unloaded the SUV, as if expecting something to emerge from the tree line. Brandon, ever the salesman, tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, you guys are acting like we're in a horror movie. It's just trees and squirrels." But even he seemed subdued as we set up our tents in the fading afternoon light. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came when we tried to start a campfire. Kevin had brought one of those fancy camp stoves, but Janet insisted on an authentic experience. We gathered dry wood, arranged it in a perfect teepee formation, and used Kevin's supposedly foolproof fire-starting kit. The kindling caught immediately, flames dancing orange and warm. Then, without warning, the fire turned blue. Not the blue of a gas flame, but an unnatural electric blue that made my teeth ache to look at. "That's different," Kevin said, his technical mind trying to rationalize what we were seeing. "Maybe there's some kind of mineral in the wood?" But the blue flames lasted only moments before gutting out completely, leaving behind a circle of ash that looked days old despite burning for less than 5 minutes. We tried 3 more times, using different wood, different positions, even dousing the area with water and starting fresh. Same result every time. Normal flames for seconds, then that sickening blue, then nothing but cold ash. "We'll use the camp stove," Brandon declared, but his voice had lost its usual authority. We cooked our dinner in relative silence, the metal taste of canned soup somehow appropriate for our growing unease. As darkness settled over the clearing like a heavy blanket, the forest around us began to change. The silence was replaced by sounds that were almost familiar but not quite right. Branches creaking in patterns that suggested footsteps. Wind through leaves that sounded too much like whispered conversations. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Is anyone else hearing that?" Sarah asked, setting down her soup can with hands that shook slightly. We all heard it, though none of us could describe it accurately. It was like standing too close to massive electrical equipment, feeling the vibration in your bones rather than truly hearing it with your ears. The sound made my fillings ache and turned my stomach into a tight knot of anxiety. Janet checked her phone for the 100th time that evening. "No signal at all now," she reported. "The screen won't even stay on for more than a few seconds." Kevin pulled out his device, a high-end smartphone he'd been bragging about all week. The screen was completely black. When he pressed the power button, it flickered to life just long enough to show impossible images. Our campsite from above, as if photographed from a great height but twisted and wrong. The stream flowed backward. Our tents were arranged in patterns we hadn't made, and there were figures in the clearing that definitely weren't us. "That's not possible," Kevin whispered, but the phone died again before he could investigate further. By the time we zipped ourselves into our tents, the humming had grown louder and taken on an almost musical quality. It rose and fell in rhythms that suggested breathing, as if the entire forest was a single, massive organism. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling and trying to convince myself that we were just letting our imagination run wild. City people scared by unfamiliar nature sounds. Nothing more. I must have eventually fallen asleep because I woke to Sarah screaming. The sound cut through the night like a rusty blade, raw and primal and absolutely terrified. I unzipped my tent and stumbled into the clearing, joined immediately by Kevin and Brandon. Janet's tent remained sealed, and for one horrible moment I thought something had happened to her too. "Where is she?" Brandon shouted, spinning around the clearing with his flashlight. "Sarah, where are you?" Sarah's tent was empty. Not just empty, it looked like no one had ever slept in it. Her sleeping bag was perfectly arranged, still zipped and undisturbed. Her backpack sat exactly where she'd left it, nothing missing. But she was gone. "She probably just went to relieve herself," Kevin said, but his voice cracked on the words. We spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling her name until our throats were raw. The forest swallowed our voices without even an echo in return. That's when Janet finally emerged from her tent, moving with strange, deliberate steps. "What's all the noise about?" she asked, and her voice was exactly wrong. It was Janet's voice, no question. Same tone, same slight accent from growing up in Cleveland. But the cadence was off, like someone reciting lines they'd memorized phonetically. And when she smiled at our obvious distress, the expression stayed on her face too long, stretching her features in ways that made my skin crawl. "Janet, did you hear Sarah screaming?" I asked, studying her face in the flickering light of our flashlights. "Sarah?" Janet's head tilted at an angle that would have been painful for a normal human neck. "Who's Sarah?" Kevin and Brandon exchanged glances. "Sarah Rodriguez," Kevin said slowly. "From accounting. She came with us. She was in the tent right next to yours." Janet's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the shifting light. "I don't remember any Sarah. Are you feeling all right, boys? Maybe you had some bad dreams." The way she said "boys" made my blood turn to ice water. Janet had never called us anything but our names or team in the most professional contexts. This casual, almost maternal tone was completely foreign to her personality. "Janet, you sat next to Sarah in the car," Brandon pressed. "She was asking you about the hiking trails, remember?" "I think you're confused," Janet replied, still wearing that horrible smile. "It was just us four on this trip. Always just us four." That's when I noticed her eyes. Janet had brown eyes, dark chocolate brown that she'd complained about being boring compared to Sarah's green ones. The woman standing in front of us had eyes like black pools of water, reflecting our flashlight beams like an animal's. We backed away from her slowly, clustering together near the dead fire pit. Janet, or the thing wearing Janet's face, watched us with predatory patience, her head continuing to tilt at that impossible angle. "Something happened to her," Kevin whispered. "Something happened to both of them." As if summoned by his words, Sarah stepped into the clearing from the direction of the stream. She moved with the same deliberate wrong gait as Janet, and wore an identical smile that stretched too wide and lasted too long. "Hi, guys," Sarah said in her own voice, but with that same memorized lines quality. "Sorry if I worried you. I just went for a little walk." "Sarah, thank God." Brandon started forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Look at her feet," I hissed. Sarah was barefoot and her feet were absolutely clean. No dirt, no scratches, no signs that she'd been walking through a forest at night, but more disturbing than their cleanliness was their color. Her feet were pale white, almost luminescent in the darkness, as if the blood had been drained from them entirely. "Where did you go, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "Just to the stream," she replied, that terrible smile never wavering. "The water is so beautiful at night, so dark and deep. You should all come see." Janet nodded enthusiastically, her neck making small clicking sounds with the movement. "Yes, the stream is lovely. We could all go for a swim." The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset. The idea of swimming was absurd, but both women spoke about it with the same artificial enthusiasm, as if they were reading from a script written by someone who didn't quite understand human behavior. Kevin was frantically trying to get his phone working, pressing buttons and muttering technical specifications under his breath. "The GPS is showing we're in 3 different locations simultaneously," he reported. "According to this, we're here, but also 50 miles north, and also underground. That can't be right." Brandon had his own phone out, but the screen was displaying nothing but static that hurt to look at directly. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now. Something is very wrong with this place." "Wrong?" Sarah tilted her head, mimicking Janet's impossible angle. "What could be wrong? We're just having a nice camping trip, just us 4. "There are 5 of us," I said firmly. "There have always been 5 of us." Both women laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "No," Janet said, "just us 4. Always just us 4. They were right, and that realization hit me like a physical blow. When I tried to remember our drive here, I could only picture 4 people in Kevin's SUV. When I thought about the office, I could see Janet, Kevin, Brandon, and myself, but no one else. No Sarah Rodriguez from accounting. No girl with green eyes who'd moved from California. But I remembered her. I remembered conversations, remembered her laugh, remembered the way she'd been excited about exploring Ohio's wilderness. Those memories felt real and solid. But according to my companions, and increasingly according to my own recollections, she had never existed. "We need to leave," Kevin whispered urgently. "Right now." But when we looked toward where we'd parked the SUV, it was gone. The tire tracks were gone. Even the slight depression in the earth where it had been parked was gone, covered by pristine pine needles that looked like they'd been undisturbed for years. "The car?" Brandon stared at the empty space. "Where's the car?" "What car?" Janet asked, and her voice had taken on an edge of impatience. "We hiked here, remember? Just the 4 of us with our backpacks." I looked at our campsite and felt reality shift around me like quicksand. Our tents were different colors than I remembered. Instead of 5 sleeping areas, there were only 4. Our supplies had rearranged themselves, and several items I was certain we'd brought were simply gone. "This isn't real," I said aloud, more to convince myself than to inform the others. "This is some kind of hallucination. Gas leak, maybe, or some kind of natural phenomenon." Sarah moved closer, her bare feet making no sound on the forest floor. "Why would you say that, Michael? Everything is perfectly normal. We're just 4 friends on a camping trip." The way she said my name was wrong. Too intimate. Too knowing. Sarah had always been professionally polite but distant. We'd never been friends, barely colleagues, but the thing wearing her face spoke to me like we'd known each other for years. "You're not Sarah," I said, backing away from her approach. "And that's not Janet. What are you?" Both women stopped smiling simultaneously. For a moment, their faces went completely blank, like mannequins. Then their features began to shift, subtly but unmistakably. Janet's face became thinner, more angular. Sarah's became rounder, with different bone structure. Their skin took on a waxy quality, and their eyes became completely black, like looking into deep water at midnight. "We are what you brought with you," they said in unison, their voices now identical despite coming from different throats. We are what you left behind. We are what you feared to find." Kevin grabbed my arm with shaking hands. "Skinwalker," he whispered. "My grandmother told me stories, native legends about things that can wear human faces." The creatures that had been Janet and Sarah laughed again, that bone chime sound that made my teeth ache. "Your grandmother was wise," they said, "but incomplete. We are older than her stories, older than her people, older than the trees that grew before these trees." Brandon, despite his growing terror, still tried to maintain some semblance of control. "What do you want from us?" "Want." The creatures tilted their heads in perfect synchronization. "We want nothing, but we will take everything. Your faces, your memories, your names. Your friends will miss you for a while, but they will forget, just as you forgot the one who came before." "Sarah was real," I insisted, clinging to my memories of her like lifelines. "She existed. She was here." "Was she?" The creature wearing Janet's face stepped closer. "Or did you need someone to take first? Someone to practice on? Someone whose disappearance would hurt less than losing one of your real friends?" The words hit me like a sledgehammer, because suddenly I wasn't sure. Had Sarah really been part of our office? Had she really been on the trip? Or had she been created by whatever was in this forest, a test run to see how easily we could be manipulated? "You're messing with our heads," Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Psychological warfare." "We are showing you truth," the creatures replied. "The truth is that you are alone. You have always been alone. The connections you think you have are as fragile as spider webs. One touch and they dissolve." As they spoke, I felt my memories continuing to shift and blur. Had we really driven here? I remembered hiking, miles and miles through increasingly dense forest. I remembered getting lost, arguing about directions, stumbling into this clearing by accident. But I also remembered Kevin's SUV, remembered loading our gear into the back. Both sets of memories felt equally real and equally false. "Fight it," Brandon said through gritted teeth. "Whatever they're doing, fight it." But fighting was becoming harder by the minute. The creatures moved closer, and with each step they looked more like Janet and Sarah again. The wrongness was fading, replaced by familiar faces and voices. If I didn't look directly at their eyes, I could almost convince myself that nothing had changed. "Why don't you both sit down?" Janet's voice said with maternal concern. "You look tired, confused. Maybe you should rest." And God help me, I wanted to. The strain of trying to hold on to reality was exhausting. It would be so much easier to accept their version of events. So much simpler to believe that nothing was wrong, that we were just four friends on a camping trip having some kind of shared delusion. Kevin was the first to break. Maybe we are just being paranoid," he said slowly. "City people, scared of the woods, making up stories." "Kevin, no," I grabbed his shoulder, but he shook me off. "I mean, think about it logically," he continued, and I could hear his resolve crumbling with each word. "What's more likely, that we're being hunted by shape-shifting monsters, or that we're letting our imaginations run wild?" The creatures smiled their two wide smiles. "Kevin understands," Sarah's voice said approvingly. "Kevin is being rational." "I am being rational," Kevin agreed, and his voice was taking on that same memorized lines quality. "We're just four friends on a camping trip. Everything is normal." Brandon looked at me with desperation in his eyes. "Don't listen to them, Mike. Remember the car. Remember driving here." But even as he spoke, I could see his certainty wavering. The longer we stood in that clearing, surrounded by those things wearing familiar faces, the harder it became to trust my own memories. Reality felt like wet sand, constantly shifting and reforming. That's when I heard it, a sound that cut through the psychological fog like a beacon, the distant rumble of an engine growing closer. The creatures heard it too. Their smiles faltered, and for just a moment, Their true faces showed through, something ancient and hungry and absolutely inhuman. "No," Janet's voice said, but with an edge of panic. "No one else knows about this place. No one else should be coming." The engine sound grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights flickered through the trees, and I felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost knocked me over. "Someone's coming," I said. "Someone real." The creatures backed away from us, their forms beginning to blur and shift. "You cannot leave," they said, their voices overlapping and distorting. "This place holds you. This place owns you now." But the approaching vehicle was undeniably real, undeniably normal. A park ranger's truck broke through the tree line, and behind the wheel was a middle-aged man with a concerned expression and completely normal brown eyes. "You folks all right?" he called out, stepping from the truck. "We had reports of screaming from this area. You're not supposed to be camping here. This is a restricted zone." The creatures that had been Janet and Sarah hissed like steam escaping from a pressure valve. Their forms began to unravel, revealing glimpses of something dark and shapeless underneath the stolen faces. "Run!" I shouted to Kevin and Brandon. "Run now!" We sprinted toward the ranger's truck, the creatures in human shrieks echoing behind us. I risked a glance back and saw them melting into the shadows between the trees, their stolen faces sliding off like masks. The ranger helped us into his truck, asking questions about our condition and how we'd gotten to such a remote area. But I barely heard him. I was too busy staring at the empty clearing where our campsite had been. No tents, no supplies, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. "Your friends," the ranger said, misinterpreting my backward glances. "We'll send a search team for them." "Friends?" I asked. "The two women who were with you. Your report mentioned 5 people in your group." I looked at Kevin and Brandon, both of whom stared back with blank confusion. "It was just us 3, Brandon said slowly. "It's always been just us 3. But the ranger had my original camping permit application, filled out in Janet's handwriting and clearly listing 5 names: Michael Williams, Kevin King, Brandon Edwards, Janet Reed, and Sarah Rodriguez. "These women," the ranger pressed, "Janet Reed and Sarah Rodriguez, where are they?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I had no idea. I could remember fragments, brown eyes that turned black, impossible smiles, voices that spoke with memorized inflection. But the more I tried to grasp those memories, the more they slipped away like smoke. "I don't know," I finally admitted. "I don't remember them at all." The ranger found our real campsite 3 miles away, the one we'd originally planned to use before somehow ending up in that restricted clearing. Our tents were set up exactly as we'd left them, our supplies undisturbed. Kevin's SUV was parked nearby, keys still in the ignition. According to the timestamps on Kevin's digital camera, we'd been missing for 3 days. The last photos showed all 5 of us arriving at the forest, smiling and excited for our adventure. Janet Reed and Sarah Rodriguez were clearly visible in every image. Janet with her nervous energy and brown eyes, Sarah with her enthusiasm and California accent. But none of us could remember them as anything more than faces in photographs. The official investigation found no trace of the missing women, no footprints, no abandoned belongings, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist the moment we entered that restricted clearing. The ranger who'd rescued us reported finding us in a state of severe dehydration and psychological distress, babbling about impossible things and insisting that our group had only ever consisted of 3 people. Kevin quit his job 2 weeks after we returned. He claimed the experience had made him question the nature of reality itself, and he couldn't trust his own perceptions anymore. Brandon transferred to a different department, and we rarely spoke after that. When we did, neither of us mentioned the camping trip. As for me, I found myself spending hours staring at those digital photos, trying to force myself to remember the women who smiled back at me from the camera's memory. I knew they had been real people with real lives and real families who were now grieving their disappearance, but try as I might, I couldn't recall a single conversation with either of them, Couldn't remember their voices or their personalities beyond what I could infer from the photos. The worst part was the growing suspicion that they hadn't been taken by the creatures in that clearing. The worst part was the fear that they had never existed at all, that the things we encountered had created them from our own expectations and memories, building complex, false histories around phantom people we thought we knew. 6 months later, I was cleaning out my desk when I found a memo from Janet Reed dated the day before our camping trip. It was a routine office communication about updated safety protocols, signed in her distinctive handwriting. But according to our company records, no one named Janet Reed had ever worked for our insurance agency. The memo was the only physical evidence that she had ever existed, and even that disappeared when I tried to show it to HR. I put it down on my desk for just a moment to grab a witness, and when I looked back, the paper was blank. I still live in Ohio, though I've moved to the center of Columbus where the lights are always on and the sounds of traffic drown out any whispers from dark places. I've never been camping again. I avoid forests entirely, especially the remote areas where cell phones lose signal and GPS systems malfunction. But sometimes, usually just before dawn, I hear that humming sound again. That low, electrical vibration that seems to come from the earth itself. And sometimes, when I'm walking through crowded places, I catch glimpses of familiar faces in my peripheral vision. A woman with brown eyes and nervous energy. A younger woman with green eyes and a California accent. When I turn to look directly at them, they're always gone. But for just a moment, they looked so real, so alive, so much like people I should remember but don't. The doctors say it's post-traumatic stress, that my mind is trying to fill in gaps from a traumatic experience. They prescribe medications and therapy sessions and assure me that the flashbacks will fade with time. But I know better. I know that somewhere in the remote wilderness of southeastern Ohio, in a clearing that exists between the spaces on our maps, something ancient and hungry is still wearing stolen faces and practicing human voices. Something that feeds on memory and connection, that grows stronger by making us forget the people we've lost. And I know that Janet Reed and Sarah Rodriguez are still there, trapped in forms that are almost but not quite right, waiting for the next group of friends to stumble into that impossible clearing where the fire burns blue and time moves in circles, and 5 people become 4, becomes 3, becomes none. The most terrifying part isn't what I remember about that night. It's what I've forgotten, and the growing certainty that I wasn't supposed to escape at all. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Salt Fork State Park in southeastern Ohio, where the ancient hills hold secrets that should never be disturbed. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, Jake Morrison, and Danny Chen getting away from our soul-crushing cubicle jobs at the insurance firm. We'd been planning this escape to the backcountry for months, poring over topographical maps of the lesser-known trails that snaked through the dense forests surrounding Salt Fork Lake. The kind of trails that didn't appear on the glossy park brochures, the ones that local rangers warned inexperienced hikers to avoid. Danny had discovered an old hunting cabin marked on a 1940s survey map, supposedly abandoned deep in the woods near Beaching Ridge. Perfect base camp, he'd said, spreading the yellowed paper across his desk during lunch break. No cell towers, no tourists, just us and nature. Jake had immediately agreed, his eyes lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm he usually reserved for craft beer and true crime documentaries. I should have listened to the knot of unease that twisted in my stomach when I looked at that map. The area around the cabin was marked with strange symbols, triangles and crosses that didn't match any standard cartographic notation I'd ever seen. But I dismissed it as outdated surveying techniques, too eager for 3 days away from fluorescent lights and performance reviews to question what those symbols might actually mean. The drive to Salt Fork took us through increasingly desolate countryside. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests of oak and maple, their autumn leaves creating a tunnel of rust and gold over the winding back roads. We passed through tiny communities with names like Lore City and Cumberland, places that seemed to exist in a different century, where weathered faces watched our car from sagging front porches with expressions that weren't quite hostile but weren't welcoming either. "Friendly locals," Jake had muttered as we drove past a cluster of trailers where children's toys lay scattered in yards that hadn't seen a mower in months. Several of the adults we'd seen had physical deformities, missing fingers, scarred faces, a woman with one milky white eye who'd stared at our car with unsettling intensity. "Probably just a rough area," Danny had said, but his voice carried an uncertain edge. "Mining country. Hard living." The trailhead was exactly where the map indicated. A barely visible break in the tree line marked only by 2 rotting posts that might once have held a sign. We shouldered our packs and headed into the forest just after noon, following what could generously be called a path. Fallen logs blocked the way every few hundred yards, forcing us to climb over or crawl under obstacles that seemed deliberately placed. The woods felt wrong from the beginning, not in any way I could articulate, just an oppressive heaviness that settled over us like a wet blanket. The trees grew too close together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the afternoon sun. More unsettling was the silence. No bird song, no squirrel chatter, not even the buzz of insects. Just the crunch of our boots on dead leaves and the whisper of wind through bare branches. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake said after we'd been hiking for about an hour. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. "It's like a graveyard." "Just your imagination," Danny replied, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder. "Old-growth forests are always quiet." The cabin appeared suddenly, as if it had materialized from the trees themselves. One moment we were pushing through a particularly dense thicket. The next, we stood in a small clearing dominated by a structure that had no business still standing. The hunting cabin was larger than I'd expected, 2 stories of weathered logs and corrugated metal roofing, with a stone chimney that leaned at a precarious angle. Ivy and wild grapevines had claimed most of the exterior walls, giving the building an organic, almost alive appearance. But it was the details that made my skin crawl. Animal skulls hung from the eaves, deer, rabbits, what looked like a large dog or possibly a wolf. They dangled on rusted chains, turning slowly in the breeze with hollow eye sockets that seemed to track our movement. More disturbing were the symbols carved into the logs around the doorframe. The same triangles and crosses from the old map, but also spirals and jagged lines that hurt to look at directly. "Hunter's trophies," Danny said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Probably been here for decades." Jake approached one of the skulls, a massive deer head with antlers that sprawled nearly 4 feet across. "This thing's huge. Look at the size of those points." He reached out to touch it, then jerked his hand back. "Christ, it's still warm." "Impossible," I said, but when I moved closer I could feel heat radiating from the bone. Sun must have been hitting it. "There's no sun," Jake pointed out. He was right. The canopy above us was so thick that the clearing existed in perpetual twilight, lit only by the gray glow of an overcast sky. The cabin's interior was a study in decay and neglect. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated gaps in the roof, and the floorboards sagged alarmingly under our weight. But someone had been here recently. The stone fireplace showed signs of recent use. Fresh ashes, partially burned logs that still smelled of smoke. A rough wooden table held the remnants of a meal, tin cans scraped clean, crumbs of hardtack, and a coffee pot that was still slightly warm to the touch. "Squatters," Danny said, setting down his pack. "Probably cleared out when they heard us coming." "Or they're watching us right now," Jake muttered, peering out one of the grimy windows. "This whole setup feels like a trap." I wanted to agree with him, to suggest we find somewhere else to camp, but exhaustion was setting in. We'd hiked nearly 6 miles through difficult terrain, and the thought of shouldering our packs again was unbearable. "We'll stay the night," I decided. "If we don't like the vibe, we can head back tomorrow." We spent the remaining daylight hours setting up our gear and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. Jake discovered a well behind the building, its water tasting of minerals and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and slightly sweet that lingered unpleasantly on the tongue. Danny found what looked like a small cemetery about 50 yards into the tree line, marked by rough stone cairns arranged in a perfect circle. Native American burial site, maybe, he suggested, but his voice was uncertain. The stones were covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen on the cabin, and the ground within the circle was completely barren. No grass, no weeds, just dark earth that felt spongy underfoot. "We should leave it alone," I said, backing away from the site. Something about the arrangement made my teeth ache, as if the stones were vibrating at a frequency just below human hearing. As evening approached, we built a fire in the cabin's fireplace and prepared dinner from our dehydrated camping meals. The flames burned strangely, shifting between normal orange and an unsettling blue-green that cast weird shadows on the walls. More than once I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished the moment I turned to look directly at them. "Anyone else notice the fire acting weird?" Jake asked, poking at the logs with a stick. The wood was bone dry, but it hissed and popped as if soaked with water. "And what's that smell?" There was definitely an odor, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. It seemed to grow stronger as the fire burned, mixing with the wood smoke to create something almost nauseating. "Probably just the local wood," Danny said, but I noticed he'd moved his sleeping bag closer to the door. Different trees burned differently. Night fell with unnatural speed, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sky. One moment, the windows showed the gray gloom of dusk. The next, they were black mirrors reflecting our fire-lit faces. The silence outside was complete. No owl calls, no rustling of nocturnal animals, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. That's when we heard the first sound from the forest. It started as a low moan, almost subsonic, that seemed to come from the ground itself. The three of us froze, listening intently as the sound grew louder and more distinct. Not quite human, but not entirely animal either. It held notes of pain and hunger and something else, an intelligence that was utterly alien. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Not the quick patter of deer hooves or the shambling gait of a bear, but the deliberate, measured tread of something that walked upright. Something that was taking its time, studying us. Danny grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the window. Probably just a "don't." I caught his arm before he could look outside. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to stay away from those windows, to not let whatever was out there see us clearly. Just don't look. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that we could hear the individual leaves crunching underfoot, sometimes fading to the edge of perception before returning. Occasionally, they were joined by other sounds, scraping like claws on bark, and a wet, sliding noise that made my skin crawl. None of us slept that first night. By morning, the sounds had stopped, but their absence felt more ominous than their presence. We stumbled outside into gray dawn light to find our campsite subtly altered. Our gear was still where we'd left it, but everything had been moved slightly. Packs turned at different angles, boots arranged in a perfect line, Jake's camp chair relocated 15 feet from where he'd left it. More disturbing were the tracks. The soft earth around the cabin was covered with prints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were roughly human-shaped but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. They circled the cabin dozens of times, sometimes overlapping, sometimes forming strange geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate. "We're leaving," I announced, already reaching for my pack. "Wait." Danny knelt beside one of the clearer prints, holding his hand up for comparison. The track was nearly twice the length of his palm, with a depth that suggested something incredibly heavy. "I want to document this. This could be significant." Significant of what? That we're about to become statistics in some unsolved disappearance case? Come on, Mike. This is probably just a local playing pranks on campers, trying to scare us off." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What local? We haven't seen another person for miles, and no human made these tracks." But Danny was already unpacking his camera, snapping photos of the prints from multiple angles. "Look at the depth, the spacing. This is either an unknown species or an elaborate hoax. Either way, it's worth investigating." I should have insisted we leave, should have grabbed their packs and forced them to hike out with me. Instead, I let Danny's scientific curiosity and Jake's stubborn pride override my growing terror. We spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin, documenting the tracks and searching for other signs of whatever had visited us. The trail led deeper into the forest, toward a section of woods that seemed even darker and more oppressive than the area around the cabin. The tracks were joined by others, smaller prints that might have belonged to children, if children could have claw marks instead of toes. The path they followed wasn't random. It led with purpose toward something specific. "There," Danny pointed through the trees. "Some kind of structure." What we found defied easy description. It might once have been a building. Stone foundations suggested something substantial had stood here decades ago. But what remained was an abomination of organic and inorganic materials woven together in patterns that shouldn't exist. Tree branches grew through and around rusted metal framework, forming walls that breathed with the wind. Animal bones were incorporated into the structure like decorative elements, creating geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. And everywhere, those symbols. Carved into stone, scored into metal, even grown into the bark of the living trees that formed part of the structure. They covered every surface in spiraling patterns that drew the eye inward, creating an optical illusion that made my head spin. "This isn't natural," Jake said, stating the obvious. "Someone built this. But who? And why?" "The original inhabitants," Danny suggested, but his voice was uncertain. "Native Americans had sophisticated building techniques. This could be some kind of ceremonial site." I wanted to point out that no Native American tribe I'd ever heard of had incorporated rusted steel beams and modern power lines into their sacred architecture, but the words died in my throat. Because that's exactly what I was seeing. Remnants of 20th century infrastructure twisted and grown through with organic matter in ways that violated every law of physics and biology I knew. "We need to leave," I said again. "Now." But Danny was already inside the structure, photographing everything with obsessive intensity. The space was larger inside than it appeared from the exterior, the walls curving away into shadows that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. Jake followed reluctantly, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that had probably killed countless cats. I remained at the threshold, every nerve ending screaming at me not to enter that place. The air inside felt thick and oily, like breathing through wet cotton. And there was that smell again, sweet decay tinged with something metallic that made my teeth ache. "Guys," I called, "seriously, we should go." Their voices came back distorted, as if filtered through water. They were deeper in the structure now, their flashlight beams creating wild shadows that seemed to move independently of their bodies. I could hear Danny still talking, describing what he was seeing for his recorder, but the words were becoming increasingly disjointed. "Spiral pattern continues. Impossible angles. The mathematics don't. Jake, are you seeing this?" Jake's reply was barely recognizable as human speech, a series of grunts and clicking sounds that raised the hair on my arms. "Jake?" Danny's voice carried a note of concern. "Jake, what are you doing?" That's when I heard the first scream. It cut through the air like a physical thing, high and agonized and absolutely inhuman. Not Danny's voice, not Jake's, but something else entirely, something that had never learned how to properly use human vocal cords. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but terror overwhelmed every other instinct. I crashed through the forest like a blind animal, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my lungs. Behind me, I could hear more screaming. Danny's voice now, calling my name, begging for help. But underneath his pleas was something else. Jake's voice, but wrong. Speaking in a language I didn't recognize, words that seemed to bypass my ears and inject themselves directly into my brain. Words that made my vision blur and my stomach twist with nausea. I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin, and even then my hands shook so badly I could barely work the doorknob. I slammed the door behind me and shoved the heavy wooden table against it, then collapsed against the wall, gasping and shaking. The forest had gone completely silent again. I waited there for hours, jumping at every creak of the old building, every whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. As afternoon faded to evening, I began to convince myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe Jake had just been fooling around, testing the acoustics of the strange structure. Maybe they'd gotten turned around in the darkness and were even now making their way back to camp. Just as I was working up the courage to go look for them, I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. "Mike!" Danny's voice called out. "Mike, are you there? We're back." Relief flooded through me so completely that I nearly collapsed. I rushed to move the table away from the door, my hands still trembling but now from gratitude rather than fear. "Thank God," I called back. "I thought something had happened to you guys. I heard screaming and—" I opened the door to find Danny standing at the edge of the clearing, smiling. Just standing there in the growing darkness, perfectly motionless except for that smile. A smile that was too wide, revealing too many teeth, held just a few seconds too long to be natural. "Hello, Mike," he said in Danny's voice. "We had such an interesting conversation with our new friend." Behind him, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, stood Jake. At least, I thought it was Jake. The same height, the same basic shape, but there was something fundamentally wrong with his posture. He stood with his back slightly arched, his head tilted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for a human neck, and his arms hung at his sides in a way that suggested his shoulders weren't quite attached correctly. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been worried sick." "Exploring," Danny replied, still wearing that horrible smile. "Learning. Our friend taught us so many wonderful things about this place, about its history, about what it wants." He took a step closer, and in the fading light I could see that his eyes were wrong. They reflected light like an animal's, but more than that, they seemed to look through me rather than at me, as if I were simply an obstacle between him and something more interesting. "What friend?" I asked, though I didn't really want to know the answer. "The one who's been waiting here so long," Jake said, speaking for the first time. His voice carried the right inflection, the familiar cadence I'd known for years, but underneath it was something else. An echo, as if someone were perfectly mimicking the sounds without understanding their meaning. "The one who's been so hungry. Guys, you're scaring me. What happened in there?" Danny's smile widened impossibly further. "Nothing bad, Mike. We just learned the truth about this place, about why it was marked on those old maps, about what those symbols really mean." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made my blood turn to ice water. It was a tooth, not human, but not belonging to any animal I could identify either. It was curved like a fang but ridged like a molar, about the size of my thumb, and it pulsed with a faint phosphorescent glow. "A gift," Danny said, holding it out toward me. "For safe passage, for understanding." I backed away from the offered tooth, every instinct screaming at me to run again. But where could I go? My car was parked 6 miles away through treacherous forest, and night was falling fast. Even if I could find my way back to the trailhead in the dark, I'd never make it past whatever was out there in the woods. "I don't want it," I managed to say. "Of course you do," Jake said, moving closer. In the dim light I could see that his gait was wrong, too. Too fluid, as if his bones had been replaced with something more flexible. "Everyone wants to understand, to know the truth about what lies beneath the skin of the world. The real world," Danny added, and his voice now carried harmonics that didn't exist in human speech. The one that existed before your kind learned to build walls and fires and pretend they were safe. They were close enough now that I could smell them, that same sweet decay that had emanated from the strange structure, but stronger, more personal. It was the smell of meat left too long in the sun, of flowers blooming in a graveyard, of something fundamental rotting from the inside out. "You're not, Danny," I whispered. "Of course I am," the thing wearing Danny's face replied. "I have all his memories, all his thoughts, all his fears. I know about his childhood dog, about the scar on his knee from when he fell off his bike, about his secret crush on the barista at the coffee shop near our office. I am Danny, just improved, enhanced," the Jake thing agreed, "awakened to possibilities that your limited consciousness could never comprehend." I ran again, but this time there was nowhere to go. I crashed through the cabin door and slammed it behind me, but I could hear them laughing outside. Laughter that started as familiar sounds from my friends' throats but gradually shifted into something that belonged in no human mouth. The windows were too small to climb through, and the back door had been warped shut by decades of moisture and neglect. I was trapped with whatever had taken my friend's place, and they knew it. "Mike," Danny's voice called through the door, sweet and reasonable. "You're being silly. We just want to share what we've learned, to help you understand." "The transition is uncomfortable at first," Jake added, "but then everything becomes so much clearer, so much more vivid. You'll see colors that don't exist in your current spectrum of perception. You'll hear the songs that the earth itself is singing." I pressed my back against the far wall, staring at the door as the handle began to turn. I'd shoved the table back against it, but I could hear wood splintering as they pushed their way in with strength that no human possessed. "You'll taste the dreams of sleeping animals," Danny continued, his voice now coming from directly outside the window behind me. "You'll feel the pulse of dying stars through your fingertips. All we need is your permission. Mike, just open the door and let us help you." The table gave way with a crack like breaking bones, and the door swung open to reveal the creatures that had been my friends. In the firelight, their transformation was even more obvious. Their skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that revealed dark networks of veins underneath. Their movements were too fluid, too quick, like film played at the wrong speed. But it was their eyes that broke my sanity a little bit more. They still looked like Danny and Jake's eyes, the same brown and blue I'd known for years. But behind the familiar irises was an intelligence that had never been human. Something vast and patient and utterly alien wearing my friends' faces like poorly fitting masks. "Please," I whispered. "Oh, Mike," Danny said, and for just a moment his voice carried a note of genuine sadness. "You still don't understand. This isn't about hurting you. This is about transcendence, about becoming part of something so much larger and more beautiful than your tiny human existence." Jake reached out with one hand, and I could see that his fingernails had been replaced with curved claws that gleamed in the firelight. "The entity that lives in this place has been alone for so long, cut off from its kind by barriers your ancestors built without understanding what they were doing. It just wants connection, Mike. Communion. And we're going to help it find that," Danny added, "by bringing it more friends, by expanding its family." I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, brandishing it like a weapon, though I knew it would be useless against whatever they'd become. "Stay back." They looked at each other and began to laugh again, that horrible sound that started human and became something else entirely. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls and floor and ceiling until the entire cabin resonated with their mirth. "Oh, Mike," Danny said through his laughter, "you can't fight this. You couldn't fight it from the moment you set foot in these woods, the moment you breathed the air here, drank the water from the well, warmed yourself by a fire built with wood from the sacred grove. You've already been marked," Jake explained. "The entity has been tasting you for hours, learning your thoughts, your memories, your dreams. Fighting will only make the transition more painful." I felt something wet and warm running down my face and raised my hand to find blood streaming from my nose. More blood was leaking from my ears, and when I looked down at my arms, I could see dark veins spreading under my skin like ink in water. "There," Danny said softly. "Do you feel it beginning? The expansion of consciousness? The dissolution of the barriers between self and other?" I did feel it. A strange tingling that started in my fingertips and spread up my arms, accompanied by a sound like whispering voices just below the threshold of hearing. Colors began to shift and blur at the edges of my vision, and the walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with organic life. "It doesn't hurt," Jake said encouragingly. "Not after the first few minutes, and then you'll understand everything. You'll see the world as it really is, without the filters and limitations that evolution imposed on your species." The whispering grew louder, resolving into words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Ancient words. Words that predated human speech. Words that described concepts for which English had no equivalent. They spoke of hunger and loneliness and the deep, abiding patience of things that lived between the spaces and reality. "Let go, Mike," Danny urged. "Stop fighting and let yourself become part of something magnificent." I wanted to resist, wanted to maintain some core of myself against the invasion, but the entity's presence was overwhelming. It filled my mind like dark water, drowning my thoughts in alien memories and inhuman desires. I saw flashes of the thing's true history, how it had arrived in these woods decades ago, drawn by rituals performed by desperate people during the worst years of the Great Depression. How it had fed on the isolated families that lived in these hills, growing stronger with each mind it consumed. I saw what had happened to my friends in that impossible structure, how the entity had simply reached out and touched their consciousness, rewriting their neural patterns like editing code. They were still Danny and Jake in some sense, but their humanity had been overlaid with something vast and predatory that wore their personalities like comfortable clothes. And I saw what would happen to me if I stopped fighting. The same transformation, the same expansion of awareness that would strip away everything I'd ever been and replace it with alien purpose. I would return to civilization carrying the entity's influence like a virus, seeking out other potential hosts, spreading its presence across the world one mind at a time. "No," I whispered, and somehow found the strength to grip the poker tighter. The Danny thing tilted its head, studying me with those terrible eyes. "You're stronger than we expected. Most minds surrender much more quickly. But it doesn't matter, Mike. The transformation has already begun. You can feel it, can't you? The way your thoughts are changing, becoming more flexible." It was true. My own inner voice was starting to sound different, carrying harmonics that belonged to something else. And underneath my fear and revulsion, I could feel a growing curiosity about what the entity was offering. A part of me wanted to stop fighting, to embrace the alien perspective that was slowly colonizing my brain. "That's better," Jake said, noticing my momentary hesitation. "You're beginning to see the possibilities. The freedom that comes with abandoning human limitations." But in that moment of weakness, I caught sight of something that gave me hope. The fire in the fireplace was burning differently now, not the strange blue-green flames from earlier, but normal orange fire. And more importantly, the flames seemed to cause the Danny and Jake thing's actual discomfort. They stayed well away from the fireplace, and when sparks popped out onto the hearth, they flinched back as if burned. I dove for the fireplace, grabbing a burning log with my bare hands. The pain was excruciating, but it cut through the alien influence like a blade, clearing my head for the first time in minutes. I swung the burning wood at the nearest creature, catching the Danny thing across the face. It shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and staggered backward, its borrowed flesh smoking where the flames had touched. For just an instant, I saw its true face underneath Danny's features, something with too many teeth and eyes like deep wells, ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. "The fire!" I shouted, though there was no one to hear me. "It doesn't like fire." I grabbed another burning log and advanced on them, driving them back toward the door. The Jake thing tried to circle around behind me, but I spun and caught it with a glancing blow. More of that horrible shrieking filled the air, and I could smell burning flesh that didn't quite smell human. They retreated to the doorway, their stolen faces contorting with rage and something that might have been fear. But they didn't leave entirely, just hovered at the threshold, waiting for my makeshift torches to burn down. "You cannot fight us forever, Mike," the Danny thing said, its voice now carrying an open threat. "The wood will burn away, and then you'll have nothing to protect you, and the change in your blood will continue whether we're here or not. You'll become one of us by sunrise, even if you burn us both to ash." I could feel the truth of its words. The dark veins under my skin were spreading, and my thoughts were becoming increasingly difficult to hold on to. Already, I was beginning to see the logic in what they were offering. The freedom from human limitation, the expansion into something greater and more capable. But I had one advantage they didn't expect. In my terror and desperation, I'd backed all the way to the stone hearth, and my elbow had bumped against something hanging on the wall. One of the animal skulls from outside the cabin, the massive deer head that had felt warm to the touch. The moment my skin made contact with the bone, images flooded my mind. Not alien memories this time, but something older and more primal. The knowledge of the people who had lived in these hills before the entity arrived. The hunters and trappers who had first encountered the creature and learned how to fight it. The skulls weren't trophies. They were weapons. Each one had been blessed by a different faith, charged with protective energy by people who understood that some battles required more than physical force. The deer skull carried the accumulated prayers of 3 generations of Cherokee medicine men who had died trying to contain the entity. The rabbit skulls held the desperate hope of a Baptist preacher who had given his life to create a barrier around the creature's domain. Even the dog skull pulsed with the simple, pure love of a boy who had sacrificed his pet to save his family. I grabbed the deer skull and felt power flow through me. Not the alien presence that was trying to rewrite my brain, but something clean and fierce and uncompromisingly human. The veins under my skin began to recede, and my thoughts cleared like fog burning away in sunlight. "Impossible," the Jake thing hissed. "The totems were destroyed decades ago." "Not destroyed," I said, understanding flooding through me as I held the skull. "Hidden, protected, waiting for someone desperate enough to use them properly." I raised the skull above my head and spoke words that came from somewhere beyond my own knowledge. Words in Cherokee and English and languages that had been forgotten before either existed. Words of binding and banishment, of protection and sacrifice. The creatures that had been my friends began to smoke and writhe, their stolen forms losing cohesion as the entity's hold on them weakened. I could see Danny and Jake's real faces trying to break through the alien overlay, terrified and confused but still recognizably human. The structure, Danny managed to gasp through the entity's control. Destroy, the focal point, in the center. The Jake thing lunged at me with claws extended, but I met it with the deer skull. The moment bone made contact with corrupted flesh, the creature exploded into mist and shadow, leaving Jake's unconscious body collapsed on the cabin floor. The Danny thing backed away, no longer trying to maintain its friendly facade. "You understand nothing," it snarled with a voice like grinding stone. "This vessel is already mine. Even if you drive me out, his mind is too damaged to recover. You'll be saving nothing but an empty shell." "Maybe," I said, advancing with the skull held before me like a shield. "But that's Danny's choice to make, not yours." I pressed the bone against its forehead, and the entity's shriek shattered every window in the cabin. Danny's body convulsed once, then collapsed beside Jake's, both of them breathing but unconscious. The deer skull crumbled to powder in my hands, its accumulated power finally exhausted. But the immediate threat was over. The entity had been driven from my friends' bodies, though I had no way of knowing how much damage it had done to their minds in the process. I spent the rest of the night keeping watch over them, feeding the fire with broken furniture and pieces of the cabin's interior walls. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes, and more than once I heard that inhuman moaning echoing through the forest. But whatever was out there didn't approach the cabin again, held back by the barrier of protective totems that ringed the clearing. Danny woke up first, just as dawn was breaking through the trees. He looked around the destroyed cabin with confused eyes, then focused on my face with an expression of pure terror. "Mike!" His voice was hoarse but recognizably human. "What happened?" I remember things that can't be real." "They were real," I said gently. "But they're over now. How do you feel?" He sat up slowly, wincing as if every muscle in his body ached. "Like I've been run over by a truck, and there's something missing. Like part of my memory has been burned away." He looked at Jake's still form. "Is he alive? But he hasn't woken up yet." It took another hour before Jake stirred, and when he did, his eyes held the same confusion and residual terror as Danny's. He remembered fragments, the structure in the woods, the feeling of something vast and alien pressing into his mind, the sensation of watching his own body move without his control. We didn't attempt to hike out until late morning, when the sun was high enough to burn away most of the shadows under the trees. I led them past the structure where it had all began, now nothing more than a collapsed pile of rotting wood and rusted metal. Whatever power it had held was broken, the geometric patterns disrupted by falling branches and shifted stones. The hike back to our car passed in mostly silence. My friends were recovering slowly, but they both moved with the careful deliberation of people who had suffered a profound trauma. More than once, I caught them staring at their own hands with expressions of bewilderment, as if trying to convince themselves that they were in control of their own bodies again. We never talked about what happened in the woods, not in any detail. Danny claimed he couldn't remember most of it, and Jake said the whole experience felt like a nightmare that was already fading. They both took extended leave from work and underwent therapy for what their doctors diagnosed as shared psychotic episodes brought on by stress and isolation. But I know the truth. The entity is still out there in those woods, weakened but not destroyed. The protective totems only contained it, didn't eliminate it. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself thinking about the knowledge it offered, the expansion of consciousness, the freedom from human limitations. That's the real horror of what happened in Salt Fork State Park. Not that we encountered something alien and malevolent, but that part of me still wants to go back. Part of me wonders what I might have become if I'd stopped fighting and let the transformation complete itself. I've destroyed all our photographs from the trip and burned the old map that led us there. But I still have dreams about that impossible structure, about symbols that hurt to look at directly, about the whispered promises of transcendence that echo in languages older than human speech. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I can feel the dark veins trying to spread under my skin again, trying to finish what was started in those ancient, hungry woods. The creature is still waiting, still learning, still adding to its collection of borrowed faces and stolen memories. I just hope I'm strong enough to keep saying no. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Wayne National Forest, deep in the southeastern wilderness of Ohio, where the ancient hills hold secrets older than the towns that dot their shadows. David Jones had been my best friend since college, and when he suggested we take a week-long camping trip to escape the suffocating routine of our accounting firm, I jumped at the chance. We'd been talking about getting back to nature for years, about disconnecting from our phones and laptops and remembering what it felt like to be human beings instead of spreadsheet slaves. The Wayne National Forest seemed perfect, remote enough to guarantee solitude, vast enough to get properly lost in. "Look at this," David said, spreading a topographical map across my kitchen table 3 weeks before our departure. His finger traced a winding path through green wilderness. "Lamping Creek Trail. Barely maintained, according to the ranger I talked to. We'll hike in about 8 miles to this clearing here." He tapped a small circle, near Crooked Run. Perfect spot for base camp. I leaned over the map, inhaling the musty smell of old paper. The area he'd chosen sat in a pocket of wilderness surrounded by nothing but contour lines and the thin blue veins of seasonal streams. The nearest road was the Forest Service track we'd drive in on, and that was little more than gravel and good intentions. Sounds isolated enough, I said. What about water? Crooked Run flows year-round, and there's a natural spring about half a mile upstream from the clearing. I've got purification tablets, but the ranger said the water's clean. David's eyes held that bright enthusiasm I remembered from our younger days, before mortgages and performance reviews had dulled us both. Mike, when's the last time you couldn't see electric lights? Really couldn't see them? I'm talking about darkness so complete you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed. I couldn't remember. City lights had been the backdrop of my entire adult life, an orange glow that never quite let night settle properly. The idea of true darkness was both thrilling and unsettling. All right, I said, but we do this right. Good gear, backup supplies, tell someone where we're going. Already handled. David pulled out a printed itinerary. My brother knows our route and expected return date. If we're not back by Sunday night, he calls the Forest Service. 3 weeks later, we stood at the trailhead parking area, if you could call the small dirt clearing beside Forest Service Road 26 a parking area. My Subaru looked painfully civilized against the wall of trees that pressed in from all sides. The October air carried the sharp smell of dying leaves and the deeper, richer scent of earth preparing for winter's sleep. Jesus, it's quiet, I said, shouldering my pack. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. David grinned and adjusted his straps. That's the point, city boy. Come on, daylight's burning. The first few miles of Lamping Creek Trail were easy enough, following an old logging road that had been reclaimed by saplings and undergrowth. Our boots crunched through layers of fallen leaves, releasing mushroom scents and the green smell of slow decay. But as we penetrated deeper into the forest, the trail grew less distinct, marked only by occasional blazes on trees that looked like they hadn't been refreshed in years. You sure about this route? I asked during our second rest stop. The blazes had become sporadic and I'd lost sight of the creek we were supposedly following. David consulted his compass and map with what looked like practiced confidence. We're good. The trail gets a bit rough through here, but it opens up once we hit the creek valley. Something about his certainty bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on why. David had always been the navigator in our friendship, the one who planned the road trips and never got lost. But there was something different about the way he moved through these woods, something too purposeful for someone supposedly relying on a map. By mid-afternoon, the forest had changed character entirely. The mature hardwoods gave way to something older and stranger, massive oaks whose trunks could have hidden cars, their branches creating a canopy so dense that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. The undergrowth here was sparse and sickly, mostly ferns and moss that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. David, I called softly, not wanting my voice to carry. This doesn't look right. He'd stopped about 20 yards ahead, standing perfectly still with his back to me. For a moment I thought he hadn't heard me, but then he turned and his smile seemed forced. What do you mean? The trees. They're too big, too old. According to your map, this area was logged in the 1920s. These oaks are way older than that. David looked around as if seeing the forest for the first time, his eyes lingering on the ancient giants that surrounded us. Maybe the map's wrong, or maybe this section was missed. But his voice lacked conviction. We pressed on, and I found myself checking my watch compulsively. The hands seemed to move strangely under the green twilight of the canopy, sometimes racing forward, sometimes crawling with agonizing slowness. When I looked up from checking the time for what felt like the 100th time, David was nowhere to be seen. "David," I called, my voice swallowed by the moss and ferns. No echo came back. I pushed forward along what I hoped was still the trail, my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest pressed in around me, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being watched by things that didn't move when I turned my head. I found him sitting on a fallen log beside a stream that definitely wasn't marked on his map. The water was the color of weak tea, stained by tannins from rotting leaves, and it moved with barely a whisper over moss-covered stones. "There you are," he said without looking up. "Perfect spot for camp, don't you think?" I looked around dubiously. We were in a small clearing, if you could call the sparse canopy overhead a clearing, beside the dark stream. The ground was level enough, covered in a thick carpet of dead leaves that squished ominously under my boots. "This isn't Crooked Run," I said. "This stream isn't on your map." David finally looked at me, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. His pupils were dilated despite the dim light, and there was a slack quality to his features that reminded me of someone fighting off sleep. "Maps are just suggestions out here," he said. "This is better, more private." I wanted to argue, to insist we push on to our planned campsite, but exhaustion was settling into my bones like cold syrup. We'd been hiking for nearly 8 hours, and the thought of setting up camp anywhere felt better than stumbling through these increasingly alien woods in the growing darkness. "Fine," I said, "but we figure out where we are tomorrow morning." Setting up camp felt wrong from the start. My tent stakes, which had always sunk easily into campground soil, kept hitting something hard just below the surface. When I cleared away the leaves to investigate, I found what looked like stone slabs fitted together with mathematical precision. Not natural stone, cut stone, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "David, come look at this." But when I glanced over, he was already in his tent, the zipper pulled tight. I could hear him moving around inside, but the sounds were strange. Too fluid, like he was made of something other than flesh and bone. The darkness, when it came, was absolute. David had been right about that. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed, but the silence was what really got to me. In a normal forest, night brought a symphony of small sounds. Owls calling, small animals rustling through undergrowth, the whisper of wind through leaves. Here, there was nothing. Even the stream seemed to have stopped flowing. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to my own heartbeat and trying not to think about the stone slabs beneath my tent. They felt warm through the tent floor, as if something underneath was generating heat. When I pressed my palm against the fabric, I could swear I felt a pulse that didn't match my own. Sometime after midnight, though my watch had stopped making sense, the digital display showing impossible times like 25073, I heard David unzip his tent. His footsteps were soft on the carpet of leaves, but they seemed to be moving in the wrong direction, away from where any reasonable person would go to relieve themselves. "David," I whispered. The footsteps stopped. "Just getting some air," came his voice from much farther away than it should have been. "Go back to sleep, Mike." But sleep was impossible. The darkness pressed against my tent like a living thing, and I found myself straining to hear any sound that would prove the world still existed beyond the thin nylon walls. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become elastic and unreliable. When I finally heard David return, his footsteps sounded different. Heavier. And there was something else. A wet, dragging sound like he was pulling something behind him. "David," I called softly. "You okay?" "Fine," came his voice, but it was wrong somehow. The tone was right, the inflection familiar, but underneath it was something else. A harmonic that made my teeth ache. I must have dozed fitfully because the next thing I knew, pale gray light was filtering through the canopy. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into a morning that felt too still, too quiet. The air smelled of copper and old meat. David's tent was still zipped tight, but something dark had seeped into the ground around it, staining the leaves in patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I didn't want to understand. "David," I called, louder now. "Wake up, man. We need to talk about where we are." No response. I approached his tent slowly, my feet squelching in the stained earth. The copper smell grew stronger with each step, and underneath it was something else, the sweet, sick scent of decay. "David, I'm coming in." I reached for his tent zipper, and that's when I noticed my hands were shaking. The metal pull was warm to the touch, and when I drew it down, the sound seemed to echo in impossible directions. The tent was empty. Not just empty, pristine. David's sleeping bag was laid out perfectly, unslept in. His clothes were folded in a neat pile. His boots sat side by side as if he'd never put them on. But the tent floor was covered in the same dark stains I'd seen outside, and in the center was something that made my mind recoil. It was a pile of fingernails. Human fingernails, torn off at the root, still carrying threads of bloody flesh. Beneath them, scratched into the tent floor with such violence that the fabric was shredded, were symbols that seemed to move when I looked directly at them. I stumbled backward out of the tent, my breakfast burning up my throat in a sour rush. This wasn't possible. People didn't just vanish from zipped tents, leaving behind only fingernails and impossible symbols. There had to be an explanation, a rational explanation that didn't involve the things my hindbrain was already screaming about. "David!" I shouted, not caring what might hear me. "David, where are you?" My voice echoed strangely, bouncing back from directions that shouldn't exist, and in the returning echoes, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Laughter. David's laughter, but wrong in every conceivable way. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from above and below, from inside my own skull. I grabbed my pack with shaking hands, abandoning everything else. The tent, the gear, David's belongings. I left it all and plunged into the forest in what I hoped was the direction we'd come from. But the trees looked different in daylight, older and more twisted, their branches forming shapes that suggested things I didn't want to think about. The stream that had been beside our camp was gone. Not dried up, gone, as if it had never existed. In its place was bare earth carved with the same symbols I'd seen in David's tent, symbols that seemed to writhe and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours, my compass spinning wildly, the needle never settling on any direction for more than a few seconds. The trees grew stranger and more threatening with each step, their bark taking on textures that reminded me of human skin, their branches reaching for me with fingers instead of twigs. It was mid-afternoon when I heard him calling my name. "Mike! Mike, where are you? I've been looking everywhere." David's voice, coming from behind me. Relief flooded through my system like warm honey, washing away the panic and paranoia of the past few hours. Of course, there was a rational explanation. He'd gotten up early to explore, maybe fallen and hit his head. The stains in his tent were probably just rust from the tent stakes. And the fingernails. Well, stress could make you see things that weren't there. I turned around, already smiling, already preparing to laugh about our mutual panic. David stood about 30 yards away, just visible through the trees. He was exactly as I remembered him. Same height, same build, same hiking clothes. He was even smiling, that familiar David smile, the one that had gotten us both out of trouble more times than I could count. But something was wrong with his eyes. They were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire visible eye, iris and sclera both, was the flat black of deep water at night. And as I watched, frozen with a terror so complete it felt like paralysis, something moved behind those black surfaces, something large and hungry and absolutely, fundamentally wrong. "There you are," he said, still smiling that perfectly normal smile. "I was worried about you, buddy. Come on, let's head back to camp." He took a step toward me, and I noticed that his feet didn't quite touch the ground. He was floating, just barely, his boots hovering an inch above the carpet of dead leaves. And with each step, the leaves beneath him withered and turned black, as if his presence was draining the life from everything around him. "David," I whispered, and even speaking his name felt like a betrayal of something fundamental. What happened to you?" His head tilted at an angle that was just slightly too far, like an owl examining prey. "What do you mean? I'm fine, Mike. I feel better than I have in years." He was still approaching, and I could see now that his skin had a waxy quality, like it was pulled too tight over something that wasn't quite the right shape, and there was a smell coming from him. The same copper and decay scent I'd noticed at the camp, but stronger now, so strong it made my eyes water. "Your tent," I managed. "The blood, the fingernails." "Oh, that." David, or the thing wearing David's face, laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "I had to make room, you understand. David was so cramped. But don't worry, Mike, there's plenty of room for you too." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a wounded animal, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my pack bouncing against my spine with every step. Behind me, I could hear David following, but he wasn't running. He was walking with that same measured pace, and somehow he was keeping up effortlessly. "You can't run forever, Mike," his voice called from somewhere that seemed impossibly close. "This forest is bigger than your maps show, much bigger, and I know every path, every shadow." I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw him moving between the trees like smoke, his feet still not quite touching the ground. His smile had grown wider, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, and his black eyes reflected no light at all. The forest seemed to be conspiring against me. Roots caught my feet, branches whipped across my face, and the undergrowth grew thicker with every step. But worse than the physical obstacles was the growing certainty that I was running deeper into the wilderness instead of toward civilization. The trees were getting larger and stranger, their trunks bearing scars that looked like claw marks from something impossibly large. I burst into a small clearing and stopped, gasping for breath. In the center of the space was a circle of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at. The stones were old, older than the forest, older than anything had a right to be in this part of Ohio. Between them, the ground was bare earth, packed hard and stained with dark patches that could have been old blood. "Beautiful, isn't it?" David's voice came from directly behind me. "They built this place for me, long before your people came to this land, long before your people existed at all." I spun around and he was there, standing at the edge of the clearing. But now he wasn't even trying to look human. His body had stretched and elongated, his limbs too long and jointed in too many places. His skin was the color of old bone, and his face was still David's, but it was wrong in every detail. The features were too sharp, the smile too wide, the black eyes too deep. "What are you?" I whispered. "Hungry," he said simply. "I've been hungry for so long, Mike, sleeping beneath these hills, dreaming of warmth and meat and the taste of fear. Your friend found me, opened the way. He was delicious, by the way. All that worry, all that guilt about bringing you here, it made the meat so tender. David's dead. David was never really your friend," the thing said, circling me slowly. "Oh, the body was his, the memories were his. But I've been whispering in his dreams for months, guiding him here. He thought the idea to come camping was his own, but I planted it. I needed someone to break the seals, you see, someone to invite me in." I looked around frantically for an escape route, but the forest pressed in on all sides, and between the trees I could see shapes moving. Tall, gaunt figures with too many joints and eyes like black stars. "Your ancestors knew about us," the David thing continued conversationally. "They built these circles to contain us, to keep us sleeping beneath the earth. But time weakens all barriers, and hunger is patient. We've been waiting so long for someone to free us. What do you want with me?" "Want?" The thing laughed, and the sound made the standing stones ring like bells. "I don't want anything with you, Mike. I want to eat you. Slowly. I want to taste your fear and pain in the exact moment when you realize that everything you thought you knew about the world was a lie." It lunged at me then, moving with liquid speed. I threw myself sideways, rolling behind one of the standing stones as claws raked the air where I'd been standing. The stone was warm to the touch, almost hot, and I could feel something like electricity humming through it. "You can't hide forever," the thing snarled, "and even if you could, you're already marked. Can't you feel it? The change starting in your bones?" I looked down at my hands and felt my heart stop. The skin was beginning to take on that same waxy quality I'd seen in David, and my fingernails were growing longer, sharper. Worst of all, I could feel something moving inside my skull, something cold and alien and hungry. "It's already too late," the thing crooned. "I'm inside you now, Mike. Soon you'll understand what David understood in those final moments, that fighting only makes the transformation more painful." But I could feel something else too, something warm and clean flowing from the standing stone at my back. The symbols carved into its surface were glowing now with a soft golden light, and wherever the light touched my skin, the waxy quality faded. The thing that had been David shrieked and recoiled from the light. "No, the old bindings are broken. I felt them snap." "Maybe they fixed themselves," I said, pressing my back harder against the stone. The warmth was spreading through my body now, burning away the alien presence in my skull. "Maybe you're not as clever as you think." The creature's face contorted with rage, and for a moment David's features broke through the alien mask. His real eyes, brown and human and terrified, looked at me through the darkness. "Mike," he whispered, "kill me. Please. It hurts so much and I can feel it eating my memories. Kill me before there's nothing left." But before I could respond, the alien presence reasserted itself, and David's face was gone, replaced by something that belonged in nightmares. The thing howled and threw itself at the stone circle, but the golden light flared brighter, and it was thrown back like it had hit an invisible wall. "You cannot stay there forever," it snarled. "The light will fade, and when it does, I'll be waiting." It was right, of course. I could already feel the warmth from the stone beginning to diminish, and the alien whispers in my head were growing stronger. Whatever force had protected this place for centuries was weakening, and when it failed completely, I would be defenseless. That's when I remembered the matches in my pack. Fire had always been humanity's first defense against the dark. I pulled out my waterproof container and struck a match, holding the tiny flame up like a torch. The creature flinched away from the light, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. It cast no shadow. "Fire!" it hissed. "Clever monkey. But how long can you keep it burning?" Not long, I realized. I had maybe 20 matches, and even if I could find enough dry wood in this alien forest, I'd eventually run out of fuel. But maybe I didn't need to burn forever. Maybe I just needed to burn hot enough. I started breaking branches from the stunted trees around the clearing, piling them against the base of the standing stone. The creature watched with what might have been amusement, still keeping its distance from the fading golden light. "Building your own funeral pyre?" it asked. "How thoughtful." But I wasn't building a funeral pyre. I was building something else, something I'd learned about in Boy Scouts decades ago. A signal fire. I lit the pile just as the golden light from the stones died completely. The creature lunged forward with a shriek of triumph, but I was ready. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it like a club, catching the thing across what had been David's face. It screamed and stumbled backward, smoke rising from the blackened flesh. "Fire can't kill me," it raged. "I am older than your species. I fed on your ancestors when they cowered in caves." "Maybe not," I said, lighting another branch. "But it can hurt you, and hurt things make mistakes." I kept the creature at bay with the burning branches while the signal fire grew hotter and brighter, sending a column of smoke up through the canopy. It was a desperate gamble. Even if someone saw the smoke, would they be able to find me in this impossible forest? And would they arrive before my fuel ran out? The creature seemed to read my thoughts. "No one will come," it laughed. This place exists between the spaces on your maps. Your rescue helicopters will fly overhead and see nothing but trees. But it was wrong. Maybe the forest was older than maps. Maybe it existed in the cracks between reality. But fire was older still. Fire was the first tool, the first magic, the first weapon against the hungry dark. And as the flames reached higher, I felt something change in the air around us. The creature felt it too. Its confident laughter died away, replaced by something that might have been fear. "What have you done?" it whispered. I didn't know, but I could feel the forest shifting around us, the alien wrongness beginning to fade. The trees were becoming just trees again, their bark losing that skin-like texture. The shadows were retreating to their proper places, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of helicopters. "The bindings," the creature said, and its voice was smaller now, more human. "The fire is restoring the bindings." It was shrinking too, the alien features melting away to reveal David's face underneath. But this wasn't the possessed David with the black eyes. This was my friend, human and mortal and dying. "Mike," he gasped, falling to his knees. "I'm sorry. I brought you here because it wanted me to. It's been in my dreams for months, showing me this place, making me want to come here." "It's okay," I said, keeping the fire burning but moving closer. "We're going to get out of this." "No." David shook his head, and I could see the alien darkness beginning to creep back into his eyes. "It's not gone, just contained, and part of it is still in me. I can feel it rebuilding itself, getting stronger." The helicopter sounds were getting closer now, and through the smoke I could see lights moving between the trees. But David was right. I could see the wrongness returning to his features, the two sharp angles and the hint of something inhuman behind his eyes. "You have to kill me," he said urgently, "before it takes complete control again. Use the fire, Mike. Burn it out of me." "I can't." "You have to." His voice was becoming less human with each word, and his fingernails were growing long and sharp again. "It's fighting the bindings, and I don't know how long they'll hold. If it breaks free again." He was right, and we both knew it. The creature was already reasserting itself, David's face distorting as something alien pressed against it from the inside. In moments, my friend would be gone again, and the thing that wore his face would be free to hunt. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire, the flames licking at my hands and filling the air with the smell of singed hair. David looked up at me with eyes that were still mostly human, still mostly my friend. "Thank you," he whispered. I brought the brand down with all my strength, and David's scream cut through the forest like a blade. But underneath it was another sound, a shriek of rage and pain that seemed to come from the earth itself. The creature fought me, David's body convulsing as two wills struggled for control. "Burn it," David gasped during a moment of clarity. "Burn it all." I pressed the burning wood against his chest, and the smell of cooking flesh filled the clearing. The creature's shrieks grew louder, and I could see smoke rising not just from David's body but from the ground around the standing stones. The fire was doing more than killing my friend. It was cauterizing the wound in reality that had allowed the thing to escape. David's body went still, and for a moment the forest was silent except for the crackling of flames and the distant sound of helicopters. Then the ground beneath the standing stones collapsed, revealing a pit that seemed to go down forever. From its depths came a final shriek of rage and hunger, and then nothing. The rescue team found me an hour later, sitting beside the still-burning remains of what they assumed was a signal fire. I told them my friend had fallen into a ravine while gathering firewood, and they believed me because what else could they believe? David's body was never found, of course. The pit beneath the standing stones had sealed itself, leaving only bare earth and the lingering smell of smoke. They said I was suffering from exposure and dehydration, that the hallucinations were a result of stress and exhaustion. They said the symbols I claimed to have seen carved into trees and stones were just shadows and natural weathering, that the stone circle was probably just an old foundation from a forgotten homestead. But I know what I saw. I know what David became, and I know what's still sleeping beneath the hills of southeastern Ohio, held in place by bindings that are old and growing weaker with each passing year. I moved to Arizona after that, as far from those dark forests as I could get. But sometimes, on nights when the wind is still and the desert silence presses in around me, I can hear whispers in a language that predates human speech. And sometimes I dream of standing stones and symbols that hurt to remember, and a friend who died to save me from something worse than death. The doctors say the dreams will fade with time, that trauma memories always do. But they're wrong. Some things are too big to forget, too important to let go, because someone needs to remember that there are older things than humanity walking this earth, older hungers that sleep fitfully beneath our feet. Someone needs to remember that maps are just lines on paper, and there are places between those lines where the old rules don't apply. Someone needs to remember to keep the fires burning. I live in the desert now, surrounded by heat and light and space, but I keep matches in every room, and I never let a day pass without building a fire, no matter how small. Because fire is older than the hungry dark, older than the things that whisper in ancient languages. Fire is the first magic, and sometimes it's the last defense. The doctors say I'm getting better, that the nightmares are becoming less frequent. They don't understand that I'm not trying to forget. I'm trying to remember. Someone has to remember what's sleeping beneath the Wayne National Forest, what David died to contain. Someone has to keep watch. Someone has to tend the flames.